Hey everyone, I'm glad you could make it back tonight. We have a long night ahead of us, 14 stories that all share a common thread. They're about that split second where the world you think you know simply shifts. I've put these together to go along with the rain hitting the roof, so if you're settling in to get some sleep, just let the audio carry you. If you're new here, feel free to subscribe or drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from tonight. I always like to see who's out there in the dark. Before we start, you might want to double-check the locks on your front door. It's probably nothing, but you never know who's more curious about what's inside your house than you are. Maybe just hit the like button on your way past to let them know someone is home. Let's get into the first story. They were tourists on a dream vacation, but they followed a line on a map that existed only in ink, leading them into a furnace where the air itself becomes a predator. In the high desert of California, there is a place where distance is a lie, and the heat is a physical weight that can crush the life out of a family before they even realize they are in trouble. In the late morning of October 21st, 1996, a park ranger named Ken Seeley was flying in a helicopter over a remote section of Death Valley National Park. He was looking for signs of illegal drug labs in the deep canyons of the southern range. The sun was high, turning the jagged limestone and red dirt into a blinding monochromatic glare that made his eyes ache behind his sunglasses. As the helicopter banked over a dry riverbed called Anvil Canyon, something caught his eye that didn't belong in the natural geometry of the rocks. It was a flash of white, bright, and artificial. He signaled the pilot to descend. As they dropped lower, the shape resolved into a vehicle. It was a late-model Plymouth Voyager minivan, sitting perfectly level in the middle of a sandy wash, miles from anything that could be called a road. The van was dusty, but otherwise it looked like it had been parked by someone who intended to come back in 5 minutes. There was no smoke, no blood, and no signs of a struggle. But as the ranger stepped out of the helicopter and approached the passenger window, he saw a message scratched into the thick layer of desert grime on the glass. In large, desperate letters, someone had written the word help. Back in Dresden, Germany, Egbert Rimkus was known as a man who didn't leave things to chance. At 34 years old, he was an architect who appreciated the stability of a well-constructed plan. He spent months researching their big American trip. He bought the best maps, booked the most reliable rental cars, and packed everything with the precision of someone who understood that the desert was not a playground, but a wilderness. Cornelia Meyer was 28 and shared his appetite for discovery. She was the kind of person who wanted to see the parts of the world that weren't on a postcard. They were bringing Egbert's 10-year-old son Georg and Cornelia's 4-year-old son Max. To the boys, this was an adventure into the land of cowboys and infinite space. They spent the weeks before the flight looking at pictures of the Grand Canyon and the giant sequoias. When they landed at Los Angeles International Airport in July, the air felt thick and humid. They picked up their rental, a white minivan that felt massive and safe compared to the compact cars back home. It had air conditioning that could turn the cabin into a refrigerator and enough juice boxes in the back to last a month. They felt like explorers in a high-tech bubble protected from the elements by steel and glass. The family spent the first few days moving through the tourist staples. They saw the bright lights of the city and the high mountain passes of the Sierra Nevada. Egbert kept a detailed log of their mileage and expenses. Every evening they would sit together and look at a large, colorful tourist map they had picked up at a visitor center. It showed the vast expanse of Death Valley as a series of inviting, multicolored lines. To an architect like Egbert, a line on a map represented a path. On their map, there was a thin green line that appeared to cut through the southern portion of the park, connecting the main valley to a military base and eventually to the highway. It looked like a shortcut, a way to see the rugged, untouched beauty of the Anvil Canyon area, without having to backtrack through the main tourist hubs. They drove into the park on July 22nd. The thermometer on the dashboard began to climb as they descended below sea level. It hit 100 degrees, then 110. Inside the van, the children were watching the landscape change into a moonscape of salt flats and shimmering heat waves. The air outside looked like liquid. Egbert felt a surge of pride in providing this experience for his family. They stopped at a small outpost to buy a souvenir book and a few extra bottles of water. The clerk behind the counter saw the young children and the minivan. He didn't say much, but he watched them leave with a slight frown. People in the valley knew that July was not the time for exploring the backcountry, but the Germans looked capable and their van was brand new. They seemed like they knew exactly where they were going. The family turned off the paved road and onto a gravel track that led toward the southern mountains. For the first few miles, the road was corrugated but firm. The van rattled, but Egbert kept a steady pace. He was looking for the turnoff that matched the green line on his map. He found a rocky opening in the hills that seemed to lead in the right direction and steered the heavy Plymouth into the wash. As the gravel turned into deep, loose sand, the steering wheel began to jerk in Egbert's hands. He had to keep his speed up to keep from sinking, but the rocks were getting larger and sharper. The cabin was filled with the sound of stones drumming against the undercarriage. Cornelia looked out the window at the towering red cliffs. The silence of the desert was beginning to feel heavy, like it was pressing against the glass. Suddenly, a loud pop echoed through the canyon, followed by the violent flapping of rubber against metal. Egbert swore and brought the van to a halt. He stepped out into the heat, and it felt like walking into a blast furnace. The air was so dry, it seemed to suck the moisture right out of his eyes. He found the rear passenger tire shredded by a sharp piece of limestone. He worked quickly, his skin turning bright red. He got the spare on, and they continued, but the road was disappearing. It was no longer a track, but a dry riverbed filled with boulders the size of watermelons. 2 miles later, another tire hissed and went flat. Then a third. They were now miles from the nearest paved road, sitting in a van with 3 useless tires and a spare that wasn't meant for this terrain. The sun was at its absolute zenith. The heat inside the van began to rise the moment Egbert turned off the engine to save fuel. The air conditioner had been their life support, and now it was gone. He looked at Cornelia, then at the boys in the back. Their faces were flushed, and Max was beginning to cry. The interior of the van was reaching 130 degrees. Egbert realized with a sickening jolt that the green line on his map wasn't a road at all. It was just a topographical marker for a seasonal wash. He had driven a 2-wheel drive city vehicle into a geological trap. He looked at the map again, his hands shaking. To the south, he saw the border of a naval weapons testing range. On the paper, it looked close. He assumed there would be guards, fences, and water. He told Cornelia they couldn't stay with the van. They would have to walk toward the base. They packed the remaining juice cartons and a few bottles of water into a backpack. Egbert took the lead, carrying the heavy bag, while Cornelia held the hands of the 2 boys. As they stepped away from the white minivan, the silence of Anvil Canyon swallowed them. The heat was a physical wall. Every breath felt like inhaling steam from a boiling kettle. They started walking south toward a horizon that never seemed to get closer. The ranger Ken Seeley stood by the abandoned van in October and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked inside and saw the juice cartons, the souvenir book, and a single child's shoe left on the floor mat. There were no keys in the ignition. He radioed back to headquarters and initiated a search. Within 24 hours, dozens of search and rescue teams were descending on the canyon. The investigation was immediate and massive. They found the rental records and identified the family. The media picked up the story, and soon the Death Valley Germans were a global mystery. Searchers moved out in concentric circles from the van looking for footprints, clothing, or scraps of trash. But the desert wind had been blowing for 3 months. The sand had reset itself, erasing any trail they might have left. Detectives in Germany interviewed the family's friends and relatives. They found that Egbert was a meticulous man, which led to a strange theory. Some investigators believed the family had staged their disappearance. They thought Egbert might have wanted to defect or start a new life under new identities, using the harshness of Death Valley as a cover. It seemed more likely to some than the idea of a smart man walking to his death. As the weeks turned into months, the search was scaled back. The case went cold. The white van was towed away, and the canyon returned to its prehistoric stillness. For 13 years, the mystery of the Rimkus family sat on a shelf in the Inyo County Sheriff's Office. It became a legend among desert hikers, a story about a ghost van and a family that simply evaporated into the thin, shimmering air of the Mojave. In 2009, a man named Tom Mahood became obsessed with the case. Tom wasn't a cop or a professional rescuer. He was a retired engineer with a deep knowledge of the park. He spent his weekends hiking the most remote corners of the valley. He didn't believe the conspiracy theories. He believed in logic. He sat down with the same maps Egbert had used and tried to think like a man who was dying of thirst. Tom realized that Egbert wouldn't have just wandered aimlessly. He would have been looking for a landmark. On the maps from the 90s, there was a symbol for a base to the south. To a tourist, that sounds like a building with people. But in reality, it was just a border marker for a bombing range. Tom looked at the terrain and saw a narrow hidden gorge that led toward that marker. It was a path no one had searched. In November of 2009, Tom and a friend hiked into that gorge. The terrain was brutal, a maze of crumbling rock and thorny scrub. As they rounded a bend, Tom saw something glinting in the dirt. He reached down and picked up a piece of plastic. It was a scrap of a German identification card. A few yards away, he found a pair of adult shoes. Then he saw the first of the skeletal remains. The scene was a grim reconstruction of a final, desperate stand. The remains were scattered over a wide area, likely by animals, but they were all within a few hundred yards of each other. They were miles from the van, but still miles from any help. They had walked as far as humanly possible before the heat simply shut down their internal organs. There was no shade, no water, and no way back. The recovery team found Max's small backpack nearby. Inside, there were empty juice cartons that had been squeezed flat, as if the person drinking from them was trying to extract every single molecule of moisture. The investigation concluded that the family had likely perished within 24 hours of leaving the van. The heat of the Mojave had done its work with a clinical, unforgiving efficiency. Forensic experts explained that in the final stages of hyperthermia, the brain begins to malfunction. People lose the ability to navigate or even recognize where they are. This is why the family had walked deeper into the mountains rather than returning to the road. They were chasing a mirage of safety that their own minds had created to cope with the pain. Their logic had been literally cooked away. The killer in this case didn't have a face or a motive. It was simply the physics of the environment. 120 degrees is a temperature that the human body is not designed to endure for more than a few hours without constant hydration and shelter. The Rimkus family had stepped into a world that was fundamentally incompatible with their survival, and the desert simply waited for them to stop moving. Today, the story of the Death Valley Germans is taught to every new ranger and search and rescue volunteer. It is the gold standard for understanding how quickly an ordinary vacation can turn into a catastrophe. The green line on the maps has been clarified, and the warnings at the visitor centers are much more explicit. But every year, people still drive off the pavement, trusting in their machines and their ink lines. Egbert, Cornelia, Max, and Georg are buried back in Germany, now finally home after 13 years in the silence of Anvil Canyon. Their case remains a reminder that the boundary between a dream and a nightmare is often just a thin line on a piece of paper. The desert doesn't care about your plans or your meticulous research. It only cares about the heat, and the heat is always there waiting for the next shortcut. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the environment, it's the person standing right next to you in the fog. Because while the desert is honest about its lethality, a human being can hide their intentions behind a smile and a blue plastic bag until it's far too late to run. It was just after 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in March of 1997. A light clinging fog was rolling off the Haine River in the city of Mons, Belgium. The air smelled of damp stone old coal dust and the metallic tang of the nearby industrial canals. A local police officer was walking a routine patrol along a narrow paved walkway that locals called the Path of Worry. His boots made a steady rhythmic clicking sound against the wet cobblestones that echoed off the brick walls of the old warehouses. The officer stopped near a small concrete embankment where the water of the Haine moved in slow, oily swirls. The lighting was poor, provided only by a few flickering orange street lamps that struggled to pierce the gray Walloon mist. He noticed a splash of color against the dark mud of the riverbank. It was a bright blue plastic garbage bag knotted tightly at the top. It looked heavy, settled deep into the silt, as if it had been placed there with deliberate care rather than tossed from a distance. Mons was a city built on the hard work of the coal mines and the steel mills. In the late 90s, the economy was shifting, leaving behind rows of red brick houses and quiet, narrow streets where everyone seemed to know their neighbor's business. Life moved at a predictable, patient pace. People spent their mornings at the local bakeries, and their evenings in the small cafes drinking dark beer and talking about the football scores. It was a place where the shadows felt familiar and the fog was just a part of the landscape. Olivier Wegniar lived in the heart of this community. He was a man who appreciated the simple rhythms of his neighborhood. He had a small circle of friends and a routine that rarely changed. He was known for being a quiet presence, someone who would nod a greeting as he walked to the corner store for his morning paper. Like many in Mons, he navigated the narrow alleys and the canal paths with a sense of ownership, never suspecting that the industrial silence of his city was about to become a sanctuary for a predator. The city itself was a maze of these small moments. In the residential districts, the sound of television sets drifted through open windows during the dinner hour. The smell of beef carbonade and frying potatoes filled the air. Children played on the sidewalks until the streetlights hummed to life, and the elderly sat on their front stoops watching the world go by. There was a profound sense of safety that came from the density of the city, the feeling that there were always eyes on the street watching the fog. Even the industrial sections of Mons had a certain charm. The old cranes and rusted pulleys along the canals were like skeletal monuments to a busier time. For Olivier and his neighbors, these were just landmarks on their daily walk. They were the places where they had worked, or where their fathers had worked. The path of worry, despite its name, was just another shortcut used by workers returning home from the late shift or couples taking a stroll after a meal at a nearby bistro. As 1996 bled into 1997, the city began to feel a subtle, creeping pressure. It wasn't anything loud or obvious at first. It was just a few missing person reports that started to accumulate on the desks of the local precinct. A woman didn't come home from the market. A student didn't show up for her morning lectures. These were people with lives and families, people who had deep roots in the brick and mortar of Mons. They were vanishing into the damp gray air without a single witness. The families of the missing walked the streets, showing photographs to shopkeepers and pinning flyers to telephone poles. The local media began to run small segments on the evening news, asking for information. But there were no leads. No one had seen a struggle, heard a scream, or noticed a suspicious vehicle. It was as if these people had simply stepped into a doorway and never come out the other side. The peaceful daily life of Mons was being eroded one empty chair at a time, leaving a hollow space in the community. The police officer on the riverbank reached down and nudged the blue bag with his boot. It didn't move easily. It felt dense, like it was filled with wet sand or heavy clay. He knelt on the damp grass, the moisture soaking through his trousers, and untied the plastic knot. The plastic made a sharp, crinkling sound in the silence of the fog. As the bag opened, he didn't find household trash or industrial waste. He saw something smooth and pale reflecting the dim orange light of the street lamps. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a dull thumping that he could feel in the base of his throat. He reached into his belt for his flashlight, his fingers fumbling with the leather holster. The beam cut through the mist, landing directly on the contents of the bag. It was a human thigh severed with such clean surgical precision that there were no jagged edges or torn tissue. It looked like a medical specimen carefully prepared and then discarded in the mud of the Haine. Within an hour, the path of worry was cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the cold wind. Searchlights were brought in, their powerful white beams slicing through the fog and turning the riverbank into a stage. Judge Jean-Claude Lacroix arrived at the scene, his coat collar turned up against the chill. He was a man who had seen the worst of human nature, but the sight of the blue bags lined up in the mud made him pause. There were 5 of them in total, all knotted with the same meticulous hand. The discovery sent a shockwave through Belgium that was intensified by the political climate of the time. The country was already reeling from the Dutroux scandal, a case of horrific crimes against children that had shattered the public's trust in the police and the justice system. People were angry and paranoid. They felt that the authorities were incompetent or worse. Now in the middle of Mons, a killer was leaving human remains in plain sight as if he were mocking the very people sworn to protect the city. The forensic team worked through the night in a silent, echoing morgue. The air was sterile and cold, filled with the hum of refrigeration units and the faint smell of chemicals. As they unwrapped the plastic from the remains, the lead pathologist noted something disturbing. The disarticulation wasn't the work of a panicked amateur using a kitchen knife. The joints had been separated at the exact points of anatomical weakness. Every cut showed an intimate knowledge of human biology, the kind of skill possessed by a surgeon or a veterinarian. The pressure on the investigation was absolute. Every news cycle brought fresh questions and sharper criticisms. Lacroix moved into a small office at the station, surrounded by maps of the canal system and photos of the victims. He realized that the killer wasn't just dumping bodies. He was staging them. The path of worry was a place where the bags were guaranteed to be found within hours. The killer wanted an audience. He wanted the city to see the precision of his work and the depth of his cruelty. As the search widened, more bags were found. They appeared near the railway station and along the stagnant waters of the industrial canals. Each time the story was the same. The victims' clothes and personal effects were gone. Only the parts remained cleaned and wrapped in heavy-duty plastic. The residents of Mons began to lock their doors early. The cafes were empty by 9. The familiar fog was no longer a comfort. It was a curtain that could hide a man with a scalpel and a blue bag. The investigation hit a wall that seemed insurmountable. Despite the bold nature of the crimes, the killer left no DNA, no fingerprints, and no witnesses. He knew the city's patrol routes and the blind spots of the industrial districts. He moved through the Walloon fog like a phantom. Lacroix began to suspect that the Butcher of Mons was someone who lived among them, a respected professional, someone who could walk through the streets without drawing a single glance of suspicion from the neighbors. There was one clue that haunted the investigators more than any other. The bags were always found in places with names that felt like they were written for a tragedy: the path of worry, the river of hate. It was as if the killer were playing a psychological game with the geography of the city. He wasn't just taking lives, he was rewriting the map of Mons in blood. The realization that the killer was likely watching the investigation from his window, or perhaps even standing in the crowd behind the police tape, was a weight that Lacroix could never shake. In the climax of the investigation, the police received a tip about a local man with a background in medicine who had been acting strangely. They raided his apartment, their boots thundering up the narrow stairs, expecting to find the surgical tools and the blue plastic. But the apartment was empty. The man had vanished days before, leaving behind nothing but a stack of old newspapers and a quiet, dusty room. The trail went cold again, disappearing into the industrial rust belt of the Ardennes. The truth of the Butcher of Mons is a reconstruction of cold, calculated logic. The killer didn't hunt in the traditional sense. He selected victims who were part of the fabric of the city and then used his surgical skills to reduce them to objects. The method was as clean as a hospital procedure performed in a space that was never discovered. He was a man who understood how to navigate the boundary between the ordinary and the unthinkable, using the mundane tools of city life to display his dark work. The only detail that remains is the profile of a predator who was too organized to be caught. He was likely a lone wolf with a medical background and an intimate knowledge of the Mons Canal system. He didn't just kill, he performed. And when the performance was over, he walked away from the industrial gray of Belgium and vanished into history. He left the city with a name for a walkway that no one would ever feel comfortable on again. As of 2026, the case of the Butcher of Mons remains the most terrifying unsolved mystery in the Benelux region. There was a major revival of interest in 2024, with cold case units using new mapping technology to analyze the dump sites. But the blue bags and the surgical precision remain unanswered riddles. The families of Olivier and the other victims still look at the fog over the Haine and wonder who was walking behind them on those cold March nights. Sometimes the thing that undoes a person isn't the danger itself. It's the moment right before, when everything still looked fine. On the other side of the world, in a sea that usually looks like a mirror, a different kind of silence was already waiting for 3,000 men. On the evening of November 2nd, 1997, an older fisherman named Min stood on the edge of a narrow wooden pier in the Siê Mau province of Vietnam. The water of the Gulf of Thailand was a perfect oil-slick mirror, reflecting a sky that had turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple. There wasn't a breath of wind. The air was so heavy and humid, it felt like trying to breathe through a wet cloth, but the sea remained unnervingly still. Min had spent 40 years navigating these shallow coastal waters. He knew the rhythm of the tides and the language of the clouds like the back of his own weathered hand. To him, the ocean was usually a provider, a predictable neighbor that sustained his entire village. But as he watched the horizon, he felt a sharp, cold prickle of unease at the base of his neck. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a void, as if the world was holding its breath before a scream. The southern tip of Vietnam is a land defined by water. In the late 90s, the Mekong Delta was a vibrant, chaotic world of floating markets and wooden fishing boats that looked more like floating houses than seafaring vessels. For the families in Ca Mau, the boat was everything. It was their livelihood, their inheritance, and often their only home. Thousands of these small wooden craft were scattered across the coast, tethered together in tight-knit floating communities. Life for the fishing fleet was dictated by the seasons. The men would head out into the open sea for days at a time, chasing schools of mackerel and shrimp, while the women managed the catch on the docks. There was a profound sense of continuity in this work. A father would teach his son how to listen to the engines hum and how to read the stars. It was a hard life, but it was a shared one. The community was bound by the salt air and the constant motion of the tide. On this particular night, the fleet was out in full force. Hundreds of miles from the shore, the night crew was settling into their routine. These were the men who worked the late shifts, lighting lanterns to draw fish to the surface. From a distance, the ocean looked like a floating city with thousands of small lights flickering against the black water. There was a sense of camaraderie in those lights, a silent signal that no one was truly alone in the vastness of the South China Sea. Back in the coastal villages, the atmosphere was one of quiet industry. The markets were winding down, and the smell of grilled fish and wood smoke drifted through the thatch-roofed houses. Families were preparing for the return of the fleet clearing space on the docks for the morning's haul. The infrastructure was simple, and the technology was minimal. Most boats didn't have radios or weather equipment. They relied on their eyes, their instincts, and the tradition of the sea. For generations, this part of Vietnam had been considered a safe haven from the massive typhoons that battered the northern coast. The storms usually curved away, leaving the delta with nothing more than a heavy rain. This geographical luck had created a sense of permanence in the way the villages were built. Houses were constructed right at sea level, and the fishing boats were light, designed for speed in shallow water, rather than surviving the fury of a direct hit from a major cyclone. This history of safety was the primary reason why the sudden drop in the barometer went unnoticed by the men on the water. They had no way of knowing that a weak tropical depression a few hundred miles away had just undergone a process called explosive intensification. In the span of a few hours, a disorganized cluster of clouds had transformed into a concentrated, high-velocity engine of destruction. It was a meteorological anomaly that defied every local instinct and every piece of historical data. The first offbeat detail hit Min just as he was about to head home for the night. He noticed that the tide wasn't just coming in, it was surging. The water began to lap over the top of the pier, swirling around his ankles with a sudden violent force. It was warm, almost hot to the touch. Then the silence was broken by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the water itself. It sounded like a massive engine idling somewhere deep beneath the surface of the sea. Within 30 minutes, the oily mirror of the Gulf was shattered. The wind didn't build up slowly. It arrived like a physical blow. It tore the thatch from the roofs and sent heavy wooden crates tumbling across the docks like they were made of paper. Min scrambled back toward his house, his heart thundering against his ribs. He could hear the screams of his neighbors over the rising roar of the gale, but the sound was quickly drowned out by the sheer volume of the wind. Out on the open ocean, the fishing fleet was caught in a literal washing machine. The waves weren't just high, they were coming from every direction at once, confused by the speed of the storm's rotation. The light wooden boats designed for the calm delta were tossed into the air and smashed against the water. There was no time to prepare, no time to head for shore, and for many, no time to even put on a life jacket. The darkness was absolute, illuminated only by the white foam of the cresting waves. The pressure of the wind was so intense that it made it impossible to stand on deck. Some fishermen, desperate to stay with their vessels, used ropes to lash themselves to the masts. They thought the weight of the boat would provide safety, but as the hulls capsized, those ropes became snares. The very vessels that represented their family's future were transformed into underwater coffins, pulling the men down into the blackness as the boats rolled over in the surging, violent surf. When the sun rose on November 3rd, the storm had moved inland, leaving behind a sea that was hauntingly, cruelly calm. The water was flat again, as if the night before had been nothing more than a fever dream. But as the first rescue ships from the Vietnamese Navy began to move out from the coast, they encountered a sight that would haunt the region for decades. They found a fleet of dozens of wooden fishing boats, drifting aimlessly in the soft morning light. As the rescue crews pulled alongside the first vessel, they noticed the engine was still running. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the diesel motor was the only sound in the air. The boat was sitting perfectly upright, seemingly undamaged by the storm. But when the sailors boarded the craft, they found the deck completely empty. There were half-eaten meals on the tables and nets still trailing in the water. It was a ghost ship, a modern-day Mary Celeste floating in a sea of silence. They moved to the next boat and then the next. The scene was repeated over and over again. These were seaworthy vessels that had somehow survived the wind and the waves, yet their crews were simply gone. It was as if a giant hand had reached down and wiped every human being off the decks, leaving the machines to keep running on their own. The realization began to sink in that thousands of men had been washed overboard in a single catastrophic sweep of the sea. The investigation into the scale of the tragedy was a grim month-long process. Red Cross volunteers flooded into Ca Mau to manage the psychological tsunami that was hitting the survivors. They had to explain to wives and mothers why the boats were coming back under their own power but carrying only the belongings of the men they loved. The scale of the missing was so vast that the local morgues were quickly overwhelmed and bodies began to wash up as far away as Thailand. A breakthrough in understanding the horror came from a single survivor who was found nearly 2 days after the storm. He had been a cook on one of the larger vessels. He told the investigators that the wind had been so strong, it literally lifted men off the deck and blew them into the dark. He had survived only by crawling into a large fish hold and clinging to a massive block of ice. He drifted for 40 hours listening to the roar of the wind until the ice began to melt and the sea finally went still. The true climax of the story didn't happen at sea, but on the beaches of Ca Mau. For weeks, thousands of women and children stood on the sand watching the horizon. They watched as boats appeared as small specks in the distance, drifting slowly toward the shore. Each time a boat docked itself on the sand with its engine still sputtering, a crowd would rush forward, hoping for a miracle, only to find an empty cabin and the lingering smell of cold diesel fuel. The disaster was ultimately solved by meteorologists who identified the unique microburst nature of Typhoon Linda. Because the storm was so small and moved so fast, it created a localized pressure vacuum that essentially vacuumed the surfaces of the boats. The fishermen caught without warning had no chance against the sheer velocity of the air. It was a natural disaster that exploited the exact lack of infrastructure in the region, turning a routine night of fishing into a historic slaughter. The killer was the anomaly of the storm itself, a tropical depression that refused to follow the rules of the season. It took over 3,000 lives in a matter of hours, most of whom were never recovered. The empty boats became a symbol of a wound that would never fully heal in the maritime history of Vietnam. It was the night the sea stopped being a neighbor and became a predator, taking an entire generation of men and leaving the machines behind to tell the story. As of 2026, the coast of Ca Mau is lined with small white memorials, each one dedicated to the men who vanished during the storm of the century. The tragedy led to the creation of Vietnam's modern high-tech storm tracking system, ensuring that a fleet will never again be caught without warning. The area has rebuilt, but the older generation still talks about the night the lights went out on the water and the engines kept running in the dark. A boat left running is a sign of a life interrupted, a mechanical heart beating in a space where a human one should be. It represents a moment of sudden, violent transition that leaves only an object behind to mark the spot. In the next case, it wasn't a running engine that signaled the end, but a lone camera left hanging on a branch in a forest where the mist never clears. In early 1998, a 30-year-old American named David was standing on a steep, muddy trail in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. It was 4 in the morning and the air was a heavy, saturated blue that felt like a weight against his skin. He adjusted the strap of his heavy Nikon camera and began to climb upward through a tunnel of ferns that dripped with cold mountain moisture. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of his hiking boots and the distant liquid trill of a tropical bird. David was an experienced hiker who understood the quiet language of the wilderness. He spent his life in Seattle, surrounded by the gray towers of a corporate tech giant, but his heart lived in places like this. He saved every penny for these solo expeditions, traveling to the world's most vertical landscapes to document the exact moment the light hit the earth. To him, the lens was a way of making sense of the world, a tool that turned chaos into a permanent framed memory. He had arrived in Kingston with a heavy backpack and a meticulous plan. David was the kind of man who didn't leave things to chance. He had researched the topographic maps of the Blue Mountain Peak Trail for months. He knew the elevation changes the locations of the few primitive shelters and the specific coordinates for the best views of the Atlantic. He felt a deep sense of competence that came from years of navigating the jagged peaks of the Pacific Northwest. His most prized possession was his Nikon camera, a professional-grade machine that he treated with the reverence of a religious relic. It was battered and scratched from previous trips to the Andes and the Alps, but the glass was always pristine. He kept it in a padded, waterproof bag that never left his side. To David, that camera wasn't just equipment. It was the repository of his experiences, the only thing that made the pressure of his daily life in the city feel worth it. After landing on the island, he bypassed the tourist resorts and the crowded beaches of Montego Bay. He headed straight for the interior, where the mountains rise abruptly into the clouds. The air in the highlands was a complete contrast to the humid heat of the coast. It was sharp, thin, and smelled of wood smoke and wet coffee blossoms. He checked into a small guest house nestled on a ridge, where the owner was used to seeing solitary hikers with more gear than sense. The guest house was run by a local coffee farmer named Elias, who had spent 60 years walking the steep slopes of the Blue Mountains. That evening, David sat on the porch with Elias drinking a cup of the dark, rich coffee the region is famous for. David spread his maps out on the table, pointing to the trail that led to the summit. He spoke with the confidence of a man who viewed the mountain as a series of data points to be conquered and documented. Elias watched the young man for a long while before speaking. He told David that the peak was a living thing, and that the weather at 7,000 feet didn't care about a man's plans. He spoke specifically about the blue shadow, a heavy, disorienting fog that would roll off the Atlantic in the afternoon and swallow the trails whole. He advised David to be off the peak by noon, regardless of whether he had captured the perfect shot. David nodded politely, but he didn't truly listen. To David, the warning felt like local superstition, the kind of lore that residents tell tourists to add flavor to their stay. He checked his compass, his GPS, and his 2 redundant flashlights. He believed that technology and preparation were the ultimate shields against the unpredictability of the natural world. He finished his coffee, packed his gear, and set his alarm for 3 in the morning. He wanted to be on the ridge before the first hint of light touched the horizon. The first few hours of the climb were a rhythmic, meditative experience. The trail was a narrow ribbon of red clay that wound through massive clusters of bamboo and giant ferns. As David climbed, the vegetation began to shrink and tighten. He entered the elfin forest, a rare ecosystem where the trees are stunted by the wind and constant moisture. They were gnarled and covered in thick mats of moss, looking like petrified ghosts reaching out through the pre-dawn gloom. He reached the final ridge, just as the indigo sky began to fray at the edges. The temperature had dropped significantly, and he could see his breath in the beam of his headlamp. He found a rocky outcrop that looked out over the eastern coast of the island. He set up his tripod with steady, practiced hands, clicking the Nikon into place. He felt a surge of professional satisfaction as he checked his light meter. The conditions were exactly as he had imagined them. The sun broke over the Atlantic like a slow-motion explosion of gold and fire. David worked with a feverish intensity, capturing the way the light caught the jagged teeth of the mountains and the silver reflection on the water thousands of feet below. He moved through several rolls of film, completely absorbed in the visual geometry of the island. For a few minutes, the corporate stress and the noise of Seattle didn't exist. There was only the light, the glass, and the silence. By 7 in the morning, he had finished his work. He sat on the rocks for a long time, eating a protein bar and watching the shadows retreat from the valleys. He felt a deep, resonant sense of accomplishment. He had the shots he came for, and the weather was still perfectly clear. He felt no urgency to rush back down to the guest house. He decided to explore a few of the secondary trails that led into the deeper sections of the elfin forest, looking for more intimate textures. The first sign that something was off appeared around 10 o'clock. David was deep in a thicket of moss-covered hardwoods when he felt the temperature drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. He looked up through the canopy and saw that the vibrant blue of the sky had been replaced by a dull, opaque gray. A low vibrating hum began to move through the trees, the sound of a heavy wind pushing a massive volume of moisture up the slopes from the ocean below. The blue shadow didn't roll in. It seemed to materialize from the air itself. Within 5 minutes, David couldn't see the ground at his feet. The mist was so thick and saturated that it felt like being underwater. He looked for the trail he had been following, but the uniform shapes of the stunted trees looked identical in every direction. He reached for his compass, but the needle was drifting sluggishly. The mineral-rich volcanic rock of the peak was interfering with the magnetic pull. He decided to stay calm and head in what he believed was the direction of the main trail. But the elfin forest is a geological maze. The roots were slick with centuries of decomposed moss, and every step was a gamble. He found himself sliding down muddy embankments and pushing through ferns that were taller than he was. The silence was absolutely muffled by the heavy dampness of the fog. He couldn't hear the birds or the wind anymore. He could only hear the sound of his own breathing. The space around him had narrowed to a circle of 10 feet. Beyond that, the world was a featureless white wall that seemed to press against his chest. He felt a sharp, sudden disorientation, as if the mountain had shifted its weight beneath him. He realized with a jolt of ice in his stomach that he had been walking for an hour and hadn't seen a single familiar landmark. He was no longer a photographer in control of his environment. He was a guest who had overstayed his welcome. His breathing became shallow and jagged as the first real wave of panic hit him. The moisture was clinging to his eyelashes, blurring his vision and making the shapes of the trees look like people standing just out of reach. He felt a sudden irrational urge to run, to find a way out of the suffocating green room. He shouldered his heavy bag and began to push through the undergrowth, his boots slipping on the limestone as he climbed higher into a landscape he didn't recognize. 3 months passed before the silence of the Blue Mountains was broken again. A local coffee farmer moving through a remote section of the forest that was notorious for its jagged limestone sinkholes noticed something that didn't belong. Hanging carefully from a sturdy, gnarled branch of a wild coffee plant was a black strap. He pulled back the ferns and found David's Nikon camera. It was positioned with strange, haunting care, as if it were a sentinel watching over the valley. The camera was perfectly dry and undamaged, protected by the dense mossy canopy. It looked like it had been placed there only an hour before. The farmer looked around the small clearing, expecting to see a hiker resting nearby, but there was only the dripping moisture and the ancient ferns. He called out David's name, but the only response was the distant roar of a waterfall. He took the camera back down to the guest house and handed it to the authorities. The Jamaica Defense Force launched a massive recovery operation. They moved through the elfin forest with machetes and search dogs covering the vertical terrain around the camera tree. They were looking for a body, or at least a backpack, but they found nothing. The forest floor was a soft, deep mattress of rotting organic matter that could swallow a man whole without leaving a trace. It was a landscape that excelled at erasing evidence of human passage. The investigators took the rolls of film from the camera to a dark room in Kingston. The lead officer stood in the red light, watching as the images began to manifest in the chemicals. The first 20 frames were breathtaking, golden expansive vistas of a sunrise that looked like a dream of paradise. They were the work of a man who was focused, artistic, and entirely in control. But as the developer reached the final frames of the roll, the tone of the story changed. The final 6 photos were a descent into madness. They were blurred, frantic shots taken from a low angle. There were pictures of tangled roots, close-ups of wet moss, and one shot of the blue mist that looked like a solid wall of ice. They were the images of a man who was running for his life, pressing the shutter button in a blind reflex. The last photo was a confused, static image of the very branch where the camera was eventually found. The search party struggled with the logic of the location. The camera tree was situated on a jagged limestone ridge that was nearly impossible to reach without professional climbing gear. It was miles from the main trail and even further from any known hiking paths. There was no reason for David to have been there, especially in a thick fog. More disturbing was the lack of any other gear. His expensive backpack, his maps, and his supplies had vanished with him. The true mystery lay in the deliberate placement of the camera. It hadn't been dropped or lost in a fall. David had taken the time to loop the strap over a branch and ensure it was secure. It was a final calm action performed in the middle of a frantic, lethal situation. It suggested that David knew he wasn't going to make it out of the mist, and his final thought was to preserve the work he had died to capture. He had sacrificed the gear to save the memory. The climax of the disappearance is found in the psychological geometry of the lost. When the blue mist rolls in the high-altitude forest becomes a sensory deprivation chamber. Searchers realized that David had likely suffered from a severe case of spatial disorientation. In his panic, he had walked in perfect tightening circles. He believed he was moving toward the light of the coast, but he was actually climbing deeper into the unmapped vertical heart of the mountain range. The truth of the Blue Mountain Shadow is a lesson in the power of an environment that lacks landmarks. In the elfin forest, the humidity and the uniform trees make it impossible for the human brain to maintain a straight line. David's final moments were a battle against a world that had stolen his sense of direction. He left his camera as a marker, a final anchor to his existence, before the forest reclaimed the rest of him. His body remains part of the silence. The killer wasn't a person or a predator, but the elfin forest itself, a natural maze of blue mist and identical trees that punishes a single wrong turn with total isolation. As of 2026, the Blue Mountain Peak Trail is strictly regulated. Solo hiking is heavily discouraged, and rangers perform mandatory checks to ensure visitors carry redundant navigation tools that don't rely on magnetic needles. David's case is still told to trekkers as a warning about the Blue Shadow. His camera sits in a small museum, a silent witness to a sunrise that was beautiful enough to die for. The mist still rises blue and hungry every afternoon. That was 1998, a year defined by people vanishing into the shadows of the world's most beautiful places. But sometimes a disappearance doesn't happen one person at a time. Sometimes an entire community is deleted from the map in less than 10 minutes. On the evening of July 17, 1998, the sun was beginning to dip behind the palm-fringed horizon of the Sisano Lagoon in Papua New Guinea. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasting fish, and the temperature was a steady, humid 85 degrees. Along the narrow sandbar that separated the calm lagoon from the Bismarck Sea, the sounds of laughter drifted through the coconut groves. Children were splashing in the shallows of the lagoon, their voices competing with the rhythmic, gentle thrum of the ocean waves on the other side of the sand. To the people of Sisano, Warapu, and Arap, the sandbar was more than just a place to live. It was the foundation of their entire world. For centuries, their ancestors had built their lives on this thin strip of land, wedged between two different kinds of water. Life was dictated by the tides and the harvest of the lagoon. Men spent their days in hollowed-out outrigger canoes pulling tilapia and crabs from the brackish depths, while women tended to the thatched roof huts and the small vegetable patches that thrived in the nutrient-rich soil. The community was a vibrant, interconnected web of families who shared everything. There was a profound sense of trust in the landscape. The Bismarck Sea provided the bounty that allowed the villages to flourish, and the lagoon offered a sheltered harbor for their children to learn how to swim. The houses were built of traditional timber and woven sago palms standing on stilts to allow the evening breeze to circulate beneath the floors. They were light, breathable structures that seemed to be a part of the forest itself rather than something forced upon it. Father John Croucher was a man who had become a central pillar of this coastal life. He was a local priest who didn't just provide spiritual guidance. He was a witness to the daily struggles and triumphs of his people. He spent his days moving between the villages, his sandals treading the same sandy paths that had been used for generations. He knew the names of every child playing in the surf and the specific weight of the worries carried by the elders. To him, this sandbar was a paradise defined by its simplicity and its isolation from the noise of the modern world. There was a specific rhythm to the evenings in Sisano. As the sky turned a deep shade of orange and violet, families would gather around small fires to share the day's catch and tell stories of the sea. The elders would speak of the ancient spirits that lived in the depths of the ocean, teaching the younger generation to respect the power of the water. There was no electricity, no television, and very few radios. The entertainment was the sound of the wind through the palm fronds and the constant reassuring heartbeat of the waves hitting the beach. In the village of Arap, located just a few miles down the coast, the atmosphere was identical. The sandbar was barely 100 yards wide in some places, but it felt as solid as a mountain to those who lived there. They were a maritime culture that saw the water not as a threat, but as an extension of their own homes. They understood the seasonal changes in the current and the way the birds behaved before a storm. They lived in a state of constant quiet harmony with the natural forces that surrounded them, never imagining that the foundation of their world could be deleted. As the clock ticked toward 7 in the evening, the dinner fires were beginning to die down to glowing embers. Mothers were calling their children in from the lagoon, and the men were securing their canoes for the night. The light was fading into a warm charcoal gray, and the first stars were appearing over the ocean. It was the kind of evening that felt permanent, a snapshot of a lifestyle that had survived colonial changes and world wars, anchored by the sheer resilience of the people and the unchanging beauty of the Papua New Guinean coastline. The first offbeat detail occurred at exactly 6:49 in the evening. The ground beneath the stilts of the houses didn't just vibrate, it groaned. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck just a few miles offshore. In many parts of the world, this would be a catastrophic event, but in the villages along the sandbar, the light timber frames of the huts simply swayed and creaked. A few clay pots fell from shelves and the dogs began to bark in a frantic, high-pitched tone, but within a minute, the shaking stopped. The villagers stepped out onto the sand, checking their homes and calling out to their neighbors. There was no panic, only a sense of relief that the quake hadn't been stronger. The traditional houses designed to be flexible had handled the shock exactly as they were supposed to. Father John looked out toward the horizon, expecting to see a change in the sea, but the water looked normal. The elders noted that the earth had spoken, but they believed the danger had passed. They began to return to their homes, unaware that the earthquake was merely the fuse. However, the silence that followed the earthquake was different. It was an absolute heavy stillness that seemed to suck the noise out of the jungle. The crickets stopped chirping, and even the rhythmic thrum of the Bismarck Sea seemed to fade away. Those standing near the beach noticed something that made their hearts skip a beat. The water was receding. It wasn't the slow, predictable movement of the tide. The sea was pulling back with a violent, unnatural speed, exposing jagged rocks and coral reefs that had been hidden for 1,000 years. Then came the sound. It started as a low, subterranean growl that vibrated in the soles of their feet. Within seconds, it transformed into a roar that survivors later described as 1,000 jet engines taking off at once, or the sound of a heavy artillery barrage. It was a sonic boom that seemed to tear through the air, drowning out the screams of the villagers as they realized what was approaching. In the dim twilight, they could see a line of white foam on the horizon, a wall of water that was growing taller with every second. The withdrawal of the sea had been the warning, but for a village built on a flat sandbar with no high ground for miles, there was nowhere to run. The pressure in the air began to shift, a heavy, suffocating weight that made it difficult to draw a full breath. The 15-meter wall of water hit the sandbar with the force of 1,000,000 tons of concrete. It didn't just flow over the land, it pulverized it. The sago palm huts were shattered into splinters in an instant, and the centuries-old coconut groves were snapped like toothpicks by the sheer velocity of the wave. The land was literally being shaved off the map. As the wave surged over the sandbar, it carried the entire community with it, houses, canoes, livestock, and thousands of people, and poured them into the deep lagoon on the other side. This was the structural horror of the Atap tsunami. The lagoon, which had been a place of safety and play for the children, was transformed into a liquid catch basin of jagged timber and churning mud. The water wasn't clear. It was a thick, dark slurry of pulverized organic matter that made it impossible to see or swim. In the pitch blackness that followed the first wave, the silence returned, but it was a jagged, horrific silence, punctuated by the sound of the water clapping against the remaining palm trunks. Father John Croucher found himself clinging to the top of a coconut tree that had somehow remained standing, as he looked out across where the villages of Sasano and Warapu had been 10 minutes before he saw nothing but water. The sandbar was gone. The land where thousands of people had been eating dinner just moments ago had been replaced by a swirling expanse of debris. The investigation into why a relatively modest earthquake had caused such a massive wave began weeks later, led by international geological teams. They discovered that the quake had triggered a massive submarine landslide, A huge section of the underwater continental shelf had collapsed, sliding into a deep trench and displacing a volume of water so great it created a localized super tsunami. This was the hidden monster that the villagers couldn't have seen coming. It was a disaster born of a subterranean collapse that moved with the speed and lethality of a freight train. The rescue efforts were some of the most difficult in Pacific history. The area was so remote that it took days for heavy equipment and medical teams to arrive. When the Australian Defence Force finally reached the lagoon, they were met with a scene that looked like a battlefield. The water in the lagoon had turned a deep bruised red from the silt and the sheer volume of life that had been lost. Survivors were found clinging to floating logs, their bodies covered in deep gashes from the splintered timber of their own homes. One of the most chilling details uncovered during the recovery was the presence of predators. The Sinkhole Lagoon was a natural habitat for saltwater crocodiles, and as the survivors floated in the dark, they realized they weren't alone in the water. They spent the night in a state of absolute sensory terror, listening to the splashing of animals in the debris and the desperate calls of their neighbors. The lagoon had become a liquid graveyard, where the land itself had been stolen, leaving the people with nothing to hold on to but the memories of a paradise that had been deleted. The golden ratio pacing of this disaster reveals a terrifying truth about coastal geography. The villages were built on a precarious geological bridge, a sandbar that was only as stable as the sea floor beneath it. When the submarine landslide occurred, the physics of the water turned that sandbar into a target. The 15-meter wave was a concentrated burst of energy that focused its entire weight on that single 100-yard strip of land. It was a masterclass in environmental erasure, where a centuries-old culture was removed from the earth in 600 seconds. The killer in this story wasn't just the water, but the speed of the transition. There was no time for the traditional instincts of the maritime people to save them. The sonic boom of the wave was the only warning they received, and by then the pressure was already too great to escape. The Sinkhole sandbar was a landscape that invited trust only to betray it through a subterranean failure that no one on the surface could have predicted. It remains a stark reminder that the most beautiful places on Earth are often the most fragile. As of 2026, the Sinkhole sandbar remains a sacred site. The government of Papua New Guinea has prohibited any permanent construction on the land that was once home to 3 thriving villages. It is an empty, haunting expanse of white sand and young coconut palms, where the only residents are the spirits of the 2,200 people who were lost. The tragedy changed the global scientific understanding of landslide tsunamis. But for the survivors, it is simply the place where the world ended on a Friday night in July. People talk about how dangerous the world is, and they usually look toward the sky or the horizon for the threat. But most of the time, the danger doesn't come from something you can see. It comes from the ground beneath your feet, and the realization that the foundation of your life is just a thin layer of sand sitting over a void. In the late afternoon of a humid Tuesday in 1997, a maintenance worker named Roberto was walking along the narrow metal catwalks that snake over the Iguazu Falls. The air was a thick, vibrating curtain of spray that soaked through his uniform in seconds. To his left, the earth simply ended, disappearing into a churning white abyss known as the Devil's Throat. Roberto kept one hand on the cold, wet railing, his eyes scanning the debris that frequently clogged the safety grates after a heavy rain. The Iguazu Falls are not just a waterfall, they are a geological riot. 275 separate cataracts thunder over a jagged crescent of basalt on the border of Argentina and Brazil. For Roberto, the roar of the water was the only soundtrack to his life. It was a sound so massive and constant that it eventually became a form of silence. You don't hear the water after a while. You feel it in your teeth and in the soles of your boots as the very ground beneath the catwalks trembles. Life at the falls moved with a predictable, tourist-driven rhythm. Every morning, hundreds of people from all over the world arrived in bright plastic ponchos, their faces filled with awe as they stared into the mist. Roberto's job was to ensure the walkways were safe and the railings were secure against the constant vibration. It was mundane, repetitive work, performed in one of the most beautiful and lethal environments on the planet. He lived in the nearby town of Puerto Iguazu, a place defined by the humidity and the river. The community of park rangers and workers was a tight-knit group that shared a deep respect for the river's power. They knew that the mist could be a mask, hiding the true scale of the drops and the speed of the currents. There was a specific kind of sensory deprivation that happened at the edge of the devil's throat. The white noise was so total that it drowned out every other sense, creating a localized vacuum where a person could scream at the top of their lungs and not even hear their own voice. For the tourists, the falls were a spectacle, to be photographed, and then left behind for the comfort of a hotel. But for Roberto and the others, the water was a living entity with its own moods and appetites. They had seen what happens when someone underestimates the suction of the upper river or the slippery nature of the basalt. There was a quiet, unstated understanding that the falls didn't just move water. They moved everything that was unfortunate enough to be caught in their path, grinding it into the rocks below. Despite the inherent danger, the atmosphere was usually one of professional calm. The park was a well-oiled machine, managing thousands of visitors a day without incident. Roberto took pride in his small role in that machine. He liked the early mornings before the crowds arrived, when the only other residents were the colorful toucans and the swarms of butterflies that lived in the surrounding jungle. He felt a sense of ownership over the catwalks, a solitary guardian of the edge where the world turned into foam. As Roberto reached the furthest point of the walkway, right where the main volume of the Iguazu River rolls over the precipice, he stopped. The mist was particularly heavy that day, swirling in thick white clouds that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He adjusted his grip on the railing and squinted into the spray. Something dark was wedged against a jagged rock shelf about 20 feet below the level of the catwalk. It sat just inches away from a 260-foot drop. Initially, he thought it was a large log or perhaps a piece of industrial debris that had been washed down from a construction site upstream. But as the mist shifted for a brief second, the shape became clear. It wasn't wood. It was the distinct, rigid outline of a human shoulder. Roberto's stomach did a slow, cold roll. He leaned over the railing, the spray hitting his face with the force of a spray paint can. The shape was a man lying face down on the black basalt, perfectly still amidst the chaos. The pressure of the situation hit him instantly. That specific rock shelf was in a location that was physically impossible to reach by boat, and the current above the falls was far too strong for any swimmer to survive. There were no trails leading down to that point, and no reason for any tourist to be off the designated paths. The man was in a dead zone, a place where the geography of the falls should have made his presence an impossibility. Roberto reached for his radio, his fingers slick with aerated river water. The recovery mission began an hour later, led by the elite divers of the Argentine Naval Prefecture. Because of the deafening roar and the blinding spray, the divers couldn't communicate through headsets. They had to work by touch and prearranged hand signals. They set up a high-line system, anchoring heavy cables to the reinforced pillars of the catwalk. Roberto watched from above as a diver was lowered into the white void, swinging precariously over the abyss as the wind from the falls tried to toss him like a rag doll. When the diver finally reached the rock shelf and secured the body, the recovery team hauled them back up to the walkway. As the man was laid out on the metal grating, a heavy silence fell over the crew that even the roar of the falls couldn't pierce. The victim wasn't a hiker in sturdy gear or a tourist in a swimsuit. He was an adult male wearing a formal high-end suit and leather dress shoes. He looked as though he had stepped out of a boardroom and directly into the heart of the devil's throat. The investigation that followed was a descent into a total void of information. There were no missing person reports that matched the man's description. He carried no wallet, no keys, and no identification of any kind. Most disturbing was the discovery that the labels had been carefully cut out of every piece of his clothing. There was no brand of suit, no maker of the shoes, and no laundry mark on his shirt. He was a man who had gone to great lengths to ensure he had no name. The autopsy revealed that the man had died from the impact of the fall, but his body was unnaturally preserved. The constant cool spray of the falls had kept him hydrated and chilled, preventing the usual signs of decomposition. He looked as if he had fallen only hours before Roberto found him, but forensic markers suggested he had been wedged on that rock for weeks. He was a phantom of the mist, a perfectly dressed ghost who had been hiding in plain sight in the most crowded park in South America. The mystery of the impossible placement haunted the local police. The suction of the water at the devil's throat is so immense that it creates a localized vacuum. If he had jumped from the Brazilian side or fallen from the Argentine walkways, the current should have pulled him into the center of the abyss and pulverized his remains against the rocks at the bottom. To end up on that specific isolated shelf, he would have had to enter the water at a precise, unnatural angle that gravity shouldn't have allowed. The climax of the case came when investigators analyzed the logistics of the suit. It was dry cleaned and pressed, suggesting he hadn't been wandering in the jungle. Some theorized he was a remnant of the death flights from the regional political conflicts, but the timing was all wrong. Others whispered that he was a high-profile individual who had chosen the most deafening place on Earth to find a silent end. But without a name, every theory was just a scream into the white noise of the cataracts. The physical recovery itself was a masterclass in sensory deprivation. The divers described the experience as being inside a massive liquid machine of rock and bone. They couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. They had to feel for the victim's limbs through the weight of the falling river. It was a recovery done in the dark, even in the middle of the day. The man in the suit was finally pulled from the water, but his story remained submerged in the depths. The truth of the Devil's Throat body is that he was a man who understood the architecture of the falls. He chose a place where the roar would mask his arrival and the mist would cover his departure. He used the world's most powerful waterfall system as a shredder for his identity, leaving only a well-dressed shell behind. The killer wasn't a person, but the sheer volume of the water, a vacuum that pulls everything into its center and leaves the truth at the bottom. As of 2026, the man remains unidentified. He is buried in a common, unmarked grave in a quiet corner of Puerto Iguazu, far from the sound of the water. DNA technology has been used on many cold cases from the 1970s, but the 1997 Garganta cases remain untouched due to a lack of surviving samples. The rock shelf where he was found is still there, occasionally visible through the mist, a jagged black tooth in a mouth of white foam. On the other side of the world, in a narrow canyon where the rock walls are so close they seem to lean inward, the water tells a different kind of story. It doesn't just fall, it disappears into the very bones of the mountain. In the early afternoon of a bright Tuesday in June of 1998, a young man named Milan was sitting in the middle of a bright yellow kayak floating down the turquoise waters of the Tara River in Montenegro. The water was so clear he could see the smooth, pale river stones 6 feet below his hull. Above him, the limestone walls of the Dermator National Park rose nearly 1,300 meters toward a thin strip of blue sky. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the ancient black pines that clung to the vertical cliffs. Milan had spent most of his life navigating the rivers of the Balkans, but the Tara was something different. It was known as the teardrop of Europe, a place of such pristine beauty that it felt untouched by the conflicts that had recently scarred the region. To Milan, the river was a sanctuary, a predictable and powerful force that followed the same path it had carved through the limestone for millions of years. He felt a deep sense of confidence in his ability to read the currents and anticipate the river's moods. The group consisted of Milan and 2 of his closest friends, Stefan and Jovan. They were all experienced adventure tourists who lived for the thrill of technical water. They had spent weeks preparing for this specific stretch of the canyon, which was famous for its narrow choke points and whitewater rapids. They moved with a practiced rhythm, their paddles dipping into the water in perfect unison. There was a profound sense of camaraderie in their silence, the kind that only comes from years of shared physical exertion and mutual trust. The geography of the Tara Canyon is a vertical world of extremes. It is the deepest gorge in Europe, a jagged limestone scar that cuts through the heart of the mountains. For the rafters, the scale of the landscape was both awe-inspiring and claustrophobic. There are no flat spots to pull over, no easy exits from the water. Once you enter the narrows, you are committed to the river's path. Milan looked up at the needles of rock, towering above them, feeling small, but exhilarated by the isolation. As they paddled deeper into the canyon, the light began to change, turning the turquoise water into a deep, opaque emerald. The sound of the river was a constant low-frequency hum that vibrated in the plastic hull of the kayaks. Milan adjusted his grip on the paddle, feeling the tension in his forearms as they approached the first set of major rapids. He checked his gear one last time, ensuring his helmet was tight and his life jacket was secure. He felt ready for whatever the river had to offer. Their rhythm was steady and focused. They navigated the smaller drops with ease, hooting to each other as they caught the eddies behind the massive boulders. The community of local guides often spoke of the Tara with a mix of love and reverence, calling it a living entity that demanded respect. Milan understood this intuitively. He didn't see the river as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a partner in a high-stakes dance. He was exactly where he wanted to be, deep in the mountain's throat. The first offbeat detail occurred just after 2 o'clock. Milan noticed that the water was no longer turquoise. It had turned a murky, bruised shade of brown. A low-frequency vibration began to rumble through the floor of the kayak, separate from the sound of the rapids ahead. Then he heard it, a sharp, distinct hissing sound, like 1,000 snakes hidden behind the limestone walls. It was the sound of air being displaced by a massive volume of water moving rapidly from upstream. The flash flood hit them with a sudden, violent force. A wall of water and debris triggered by a mountain storm miles away surged through the narrow gorge. The river didn't just rise, it expanded, pushing the kayaks toward the jagged cliffs. Milan felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he fought to keep his hull pointed downstream. The pressure of the water was absolute, a heavy weight that made the paddle feel like a toothpick. He shouted to his friends, but the roar was too great to hear anything. As they entered the narrowest choke point of the canyon, Milan's world went sideways. His kayak was caught in a powerful downward current that seemed to pull him toward the base of a cliff rather than through the channel. He saw Jovan's yellow kayak flip over in the churning foam. Milan reached out his muscles, screaming with the effort to stay upright, but the river won. He was thrown into the freezing water, the air knocked out of his lungs by the impact as the world turned into a dark, swirling mess of bubbles. Milan surfaced a few dozen yards downstream, gasping for air as he clung to a protruding rock. He looked back toward the choke point and felt a cold wave of horror wash over him. Jovan's kayak hadn't floated away. It was wedged vertically into a dark, jagged hole in the limestone wall, just inches below the churning surface. The kayak was vibrating violently, held in place by a massive suction that seemed to be drinking the river itself. Jovan was nowhere to be seen, and the second kayak had vanished. The rescue team, known as the Gorsky Spaziaki, arrived within 3 hours, but the logistics were a nightmare. They had to rappel 1,300 meters down the vertical cliffs just to reach the water's edge. The lead rescuer, a man who had spent decades in the karst terrain, looked at the wedged kayak and shook his head. He explained to Milan that the limestone riverbed was a 3-dimensional maze honeycombed with unmapped siphons that could pull a man deep into the mountain's skeleton. The search moved from the water to the rock walls themselves. Rescuers used specialized underwater cameras to peer into the siphons, but the visibility was zero. They were tracking a theory that the victims might have been pulled into an air pocket inside the cliff. The atmosphere was one of grim, focused intensity. Milan stood on a narrow ledge, his body shaking from cold and shock, watching as the divers disappeared into the hissing holes in the rock. The silence of the canyon had returned, but it felt predatory. The break in the case came 24 hours later. A rescuer suspended by a rope just above the waterline reported hearing a faint, muffled, rhythmic thumping coming from inside the limestone. They realized the sound was coming from a small hidden fissure 5 feet above the current. They used heavy drills to widen the opening, and as the rock crumbled away, they found Stefan. He was huddled in a pitch-black air pocket, wet and shivering, having been pushed through a subterranean tunnel by the flood. As they pulled Stefan to safety, they discovered something that changed the meaning of the search. Deep in the back of the same air pocket, wedged into a crevice, were the skeletal remains of a person wearing rotted hiking gear from a different era. Forensic analysis would later reveal it was a hiker who had disappeared in the 1970s. The mountain hadn't just taken Stefan and Jovan, it had been holding on to people for decades. The realization that they were standing in a natural graveyard made the air feel thin. The truth of the Tara Canyon void was revealed by geologists who mapped the local karst system. The hissing Milan had heard was the sound of the river being sucked into a series of siphons, natural hydraulic traps, where the water flows down into the earth rather than forward. When the flood hit, the pressure created a vacuum that pulled the rafters into the mountain's internal plumbing. One friend had been pushed into an air pocket, while the other had been pulled into a tunnel that had no exit. The killer in this story was the karst siphon, a natural feature of the Balkan landscape that turns a river into a 3-dimensional maze. It is a hydraulic trap that can vacuum anything off the surface and store it inside the mountain for 40 years. Jovan was never found. As of 2026, the Tara River is a UNESCO-protected site, and the specific siphons in the Narrows are officially marked as no-go zones on all professional rafting maps. The shattered ridge remains a reminder of the mountain's jealous nature. Stefan survived, but he never returned to the water. The canyon continues to hiss every time the rain falls in the mountains, a sound of the earth breathing through its limestone teeth. A hiker's remains found decades after a wrong turn are a grim testament to the landscape's ability to keep a secret. In the high Andes, it's not the bones that tell the story, but the items for sale in the market. In the late autumn of 1997, a sharp biting wind was howling through the jagged granite teeth of the Cordillera Huayhuash in the Peruvian Andes. At an elevation of nearly 5,000 meters, the air was so thin it felt like trying to breathe through a layer of fine silk. On a narrow, rocky ledge overlooking a turquoise glacial lake, a solitary campsite sat in the shadows of Yerapaja, a mountain the locals call the Butcher. The sun had long since dipped behind the peaks, leaving the valley in a cold charcoal-gray gloom. A local shepherd named Mateo was moving his flock toward a lower pasture when he noticed the camp. It was a cluster of 3 high-end colorful tents that looked like bright jewels against the harsh gray stone. He stopped and waited for the sound of a stove or the smell of a cooking fire, but the air remained sterile and odorless. There was no movement, no light, and no sound except for the rhythmic flapping of a loose tent fly in the freezing wind. Mateo called out a greeting in Quechua, but his voice was swallowed by the immense silence of the high Sierra. The 3 hikers at the center of this journey were Mark, Sarah, and Thomas. They were seasoned international trekkers who had spent their lives seeking out the world's most vertical and isolated frontiers. Mark was a 35-year-old engineer from Seattle who viewed the mountains as a series of complex puzzles to be solved. He was the kind of man who calculated his calorie intake to the gram and checked his topographic maps 3 times before breakfast. To him, the Huayhuash circuit was the ultimate test of human endurance and technical planning. Sarah was a photographer who lived for the blue hour, that brief window of light before sunrise when the world feels like it hasn't been discovered yet. She carried a heavy leather-bound journal where she recorded the specific scent of the air at different altitudes, the smell of wet slate, the metallic tang of old snow, and the sweet, dry aroma of the high-altitude grass. She was the emotional anchor of the group, the one who reminded them to stop and look at the way the light hit the jagged ridges of the Butcher Mountain. Thomas was the youngest, a 24-year-old guide in training who possessed a restless, kinetic energy. He was the one who scouted the path ahead and ensured the anchors were secured during the technical passes. He had a deep, infectious laugh that often echoed through the canyons, breaking the heavy, oppressive silence of the thin air. Together they were a perfectly balanced unit, a team that had survived the unpredictable weather of the Alps and the thin, oxygen-deprived plateaus of the Himalayas without a single major incident. The Cordillera Huayhuash was in 1997, one of the last truly wild frontiers of South America. It was a landscape of extreme verticality, where a single trail could climb 2,000 meters in a morning, only to drop back down into a different world by sunset. For Mark, Sarah, and Thomas, the allure was the isolation. They wanted to be in a place where the modern world didn't exist, where the only thing that mattered was the weight of the pack and the strength of the lungs. They felt a profound sense of freedom in the vastness. Their journey began in the bustling mountain town of Huaraz. They spent a week acclimating to the altitude, drinking coca tea in small cafes, and talking to the older guides about the condition of the high passes. The atmosphere in Huaraz was one of quiet excitement. The trekking season was at its peak, and the town was filled with adventurers from every corner of the globe. But even then, there were whispers. The older guides spoke of the sombra, the shadows that lived in the high ridges, and warned the trekkers never to camp too close to the shepherd trails. Mark dismissed these warnings as local flavor, the kind of lore designed to make the mountains feel more mysterious to foreigners. He believed in the safety of his equipment and the logic of his itinerary. They hired a mule driver to carry their heaviest gear to the base of the first pass, and then they were on their own. As they moved deeper into the range, the noise of the world fell away. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the scree and the occasional boom of a distant avalanche. They felt untouchable in their high-altitude sanctuary. By the 10th day of their trek, they had reached the heart of the Huayhuash. They were miles from the nearest village, surrounded by peaks that rose over 6,000 meters into a deep indigo sky. Their routine was a rhythmic meditative experience. Every evening they would set up their camp, melt snow for water, and share a simple meal of dried pasta and chocolate. They spoke about their lives back home, their plans for the future, and the sheer beauty of the landscape. They felt a deep, resonant connection to each other and to the earth beneath their boots. The first offbeat detail occurred on the night of August 14th. Thomas was outside the tent adjusting the tension on the guy lines when he stopped and looked up at the ridge 1,000 feet above them. The moon was a thin silver sliver, providing just enough light to see the silhouette of the rocks. He thought he saw a flicker of light, a brief orange spark that didn't look like a star. It was gone before he could call the others. He stood in the freezing dark for a long time listening, but the only sound was the wind hissing through the grass. The next morning, Mark noticed a series of footprints in the soft frozen mud near the edge of their camp. They weren't the lugged, heavy prints of hiking boots, nor were they the hoof prints of a shepherd's flock. They were narrow, flat indentations made by ojotas, the traditional sandals made from recycled tires worn by the local mountain villagers. The prints circled the camp twice and then disappeared into the jagged rocks of the slope above. Mark pointed them out to the others, but they decided it was likely just a curious local shepherd passing through in the night. However, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. The isolation that had felt like a gift now began to feel like a liability. They noticed that the birds had stopped singing in the valley, and the silence seemed to have a weight to it that hadn't been there before. Sarah found herself looking up at the ridges, more often her camera bag pulled tight against her chest. She felt a phantom pressure on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by someone she couldn't see. They decided to push their pace and reach the next pass a day early. On their final night of recorded history, the group camped at the base of the Trapecio Pass. The wind was particularly violent that evening, shaking the tents with a ferocity that made sleep nearly impossible. Thomas recorded the last entry in the group's shared logbook. He wrote about the cold, the beauty of the glacier, and a strange, lingering smell of wood smoke that seemed to be coming from the rocks themselves. He closed the book and zipped his sleeping bag tight against the freezing air. Outside, the unlit campfire sat cold and gray in the middle of the camp. When Mateo, the shepherd, approached the camp 2 days later, he found the tent standing, but the silence absolute. He cautiously unzipped the fly of the largest tent and looked inside. The sleeping bags were laid out, and a half-eaten bar of chocolate sat on top of a camera bag. Mark's expensive watch was sitting on a small folding table next to his maps. Nothing had been tossed or ransacked. It looked as if the three hikers had simply stepped out for a moment and vanished into the thin, freezing air. There were no signs of a struggle and no blood. Mateo hurried down to the nearest village, and within 48 hours the Peruvian National Police had arrived at the camp. The investigation was hampered from the start by the extreme terrain and the thin air. Rescuers had to move with agonizing slowness their every step, a battle against the altitude. They searched the nearby crevasses and the jagged slopes of the pass, but they found no tracks. The ojota prints Mark had seen days before were gone, erased by a fresh dusting of snow. The hikers had become phantoms in their own campsite. The local community of Comuneros was uncharacteristically silent. When questioned, the older men would only speak of the Pishtacos, ancient white-skinned spirits that were said to haunt the high passes, to harvest the fat of unsuspecting travelers. It was a dark, deeply rooted folklore that the police initially dismissed as a distraction. But as the search continued, the investigators realized that the villagers were not afraid of spirits. They were afraid of something much more human. They were afraid of the Sombra, the remnants of the bandit groups that had long ruled the mountains. The breakthrough in the case didn't come from the mountains, but from a crowded market in the city of Huaraz, 100 kilometers away. In October, 2 months after the disappearance, a local police officer noticed a man trying to sell a very specific piece of equipment. It was a high-end altitude-calibrated watch that still had Mark's initials engraved on the back of the casing. The officer detained the seller, a young man from a remote mountain village, who claimed he had found it in the clouds while looking for a lost goat. The police followed the trail of the watch back through a market trail of personal items. They found Sarah's camera in a small pawn shop, and Thomas's sturdy leather boots being worn by a shepherd in a neighboring valley. Every piece of gear told the same story: the hikers hadn't been lost to the elements. They had been systematically stripped of their belongings. The unlit campfire Mateo had seen was the final marker of a life interrupted by a predator who knew the terrain better than any map or GPS could ever account for. The climax of the mystery revealed a terrifying tactical reality. The hikers hadn't been taken in a sudden violent ambush. They had been stalked for 3 days, their movements tracked from the high ridges by men who moved silently in ojotas. The bandits had waited until the group was at their most vulnerable, exhausted by the altitude and trapped by the wind. They had likely entered the tents in the dead of night, using the roar of the gale to mask their arrival and force the hikers into the sombra of the unmapped canyons. The truth of the Huayhuash trekking ambush is a reconstruction of a silent crime. There was no need for a struggle because the environment did the work for the killers. At 5,000 meters, a person without boots or a jacket is a person who has already been sentenced. The bandits didn't just take the gear, they took the people to a place where they would never be found, ensuring that no crime scene would ever be discovered. The items for sale in the market were the only evidence that Mark, Sarah, and Thomas had ever existed. The killer in this case was a localized bandit culture that saw the international trekkers not as people, but as a harvest of high-value goods. They were a byproduct of a lawless frontier where the mountains provided a perfect vertical sanctuary for crime. The hikers had come to the Huayhuash to escape the modern world, only to find that the ancient world they discovered was far more lethal than anything they had left behind. They had sought the silence of the peaks, and the peaks had finally given it to them. As of 2026, the Huayhuash Circuit is a popular and relatively safe destination for global adventurers, with established police patrols and regulated campsites. But if you talk to the older guides in Huaraz, the men who were there in the 90s, they still lower their voices when the 97 mystery is mentioned. They tell the new hikers to stay on the main trails and to never under any circumstances ignore the feeling of being watched from the ridges. The bodies were never found. People talk about the danger of the wild as if it's something you can measure in wind speed or temperature, but the real danger is a paradox. It's the realization that the more isolated you are, the more you belong to the people who know how to live in that isolation. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't being alone in the dark. It's the moment you realize you aren't. Speaking of the dark, there's a different kind of shadow that waits at the bottom of the ocean, one that has no name and needs no weapons. In the early morning of a Tuesday in 1998, the sun was already a searing white-hot disk hanging over the Caribbean Sea. About 60 miles off the coast of Belize, at a place called Lighthouse Reef. The water was a shade of sapphire so deep, it looked like the sky had been poured directly into a bowl of coral. At the center of this reef sits a perfect dark circle, nearly 1,000 feet across. It is a vertical limestone sinkhole that drops 400 feet straight down into the earth. Jason was standing on the deck of a small dive boat, shielding his eyes from the glare. He was a 42-year-old father of 2 from Florida who spent most of his year working as a residential contractor. He was a man who appreciated the solid nature of things, the weight of a hammer, the level line of a foundation, the way a well-built house sits against the wind. For Jason, diving was the only time he felt truly light, as if the pressures of his business and the mortgage back in Tampa were left on the surface. Mark stood next to him, checking the seals on his regulator with a rhythmic mechanical focus. Mark had been Jason's diving partner for over 10 years, a friendship forged in the murky quarries of the South and the coral reefs of the Keys. They were a perfectly balanced team. Where Jason was methodical and slow, Mark was intuitive and quick. They had a shared language of hand signals and glances that meant they rarely needed to speak once they were submerged in the quiet world of the deep. This trip to Belize was the culmination of 3 years of saving and planning. To Jason, the Great Blue Hole wasn't just a dive site, it was a pilgrimage. He had a photograph of it pinned to the corkboard in his home office, a perfect blue eye looking back at him through the pile of invoices and blueprints. He wanted to see the massive stalactites that hung like stone curtains in the underwater caverns, formations that shouldn't exist beneath the waves, remnants of a time when the hole was a dry cave. The atmosphere on the boat was one of professional excitement. There were 6 other divers, all of them experienced, but Jason and Mark were the ones who had done the most homework. Jason had spent weeks reading dive logs and studying the topographical maps of the sinkhole. He knew about the thermoclines, the points where the temperature would drop 20 degrees in a single foot. He knew about the history of the site and the divers who had pushed too far into the darkness of the lower galleries. Mark handed Jason his tank, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at the dark circle in the middle of the turquoise reef. The water inside the hole didn't move. It sat as still as a mirror, reflecting the white clouds and the towering masts of the boat. There was a profound sense of peace in the geography of the place. It felt like a sanctuary, a secret hidden in plain sight. Jason felt a surge of gratitude for the life that had allowed him to stand here healthy and ready with his best friend at his side. They had spent the previous evening at a small bar on Caye Caulker, talking about their plan for the dive. Jason was insistent on a conservative profile. They would drop to 40 meters, spend 8 minutes among the stalactites, and then begin a slow, staged ascent. He was a man who respected the math of the ocean. He understood that at those depths, time is a finite resource that is spent every time you draw a breath. Mark had agreed, laughing as he toasted to a safe trip and a quiet night. The boat's captain, a weathered man who had seen 1,000 divers come and go, gave the signal. Jason sat on the edge of the gunwale, his gear heavy and reassuring against his back. He checked his dive computer one last time, the green glow of the screen clear in the morning light. He looked at Mark, who gave him a thumbs up. Jason pulled his mask tight bit down on the regulator and leaned backward. The transition from the hot, humid air to the cool embrace of the sea was instant and absolute. As they descended, the turquoise water of the reef quickly faded into a deep uniform indigo. The walls of the sinkhole were sheer and covered in ancient calcified life. Jason watched his depth gauge as the numbers climbed 10 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters. The light from the surface was beginning to lose its warmth, turning into a dim, ethereal glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He focused on the steady, comforting sound of his own breathing, a slow and rhythmic hiss. The first offbeat detail hit Jason at exactly 32 meters. He felt a sudden sharp chill that wasn't just on his skin but in his lungs. The water didn't just get colder, it changed color. Above him the sea was blue, but below him it was beginning to look like a hazy purple fog. A faint metallic scent began to seep through his regulator, a smell like wet copper or rotting wood. It was the first sign of the hydrogen sulfide layer, a toxic cloud of organic matter that had been trapped in the hole for centuries. Jason looked over at Mark to see if he had noticed the change. Mark was staring down into the purple haze, his eyes wide behind his mask. The light from Mark's professional-grade dive torch was beginning to lose its power, the beam struggling to pierce the thickening mist. The water around them was no longer clear. It felt viscous and heavy, as if they were swimming through a thin layer of oil. Jason felt a slight tingling in his fingertips, a sensation he initially dismissed as the cold of the deep thermocline. However, as they hit the 40-meter mark, the pressure in the air began to shift. This was the depth where nitrogen narcosis, often called the rapture of the deep, begins to exert its influence on the human brain. To Jason, the sensation wasn't one of fear, but of a strange, dangerous euphoria. The dark walls of the sinkhole no longer felt like a boundary. They felt like an invitation. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to swim deeper to see what lay beneath the purple fog that sat like a floor below them. He saw Mark point toward a massive stalactite hanging from an overhang. It was 20 feet long and ancient, a stone finger pointing toward the abyss. But Mark didn't stop there. He began to swim away from the wall, out into the center of the blue void. Jason followed his movements, feeling slow and dreamlike. The logic of their dive plan was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a curiosity that felt more important than the math of their oxygen supply. The shadow was beginning to pull at them both. The pressure was rising now, and the silence of the hole was becoming a weight. Jason noticed that the purple haze was rising to meet them. It wasn't just a layer, it was a living, shifting entity. The light from the surface was gone, now replaced by a dim, bruised twilight. He checked his computer and realized they were at 48 meters, well beyond their planned limit. He tried to signal Mark to turn back, but Mark was mesmerized by a strange, shimmering movement in the darkness below their fins. Suddenly, the water around them exploded into a cloud of silt. Mark had kicked a hidden ledge, and within seconds, the visibility went from 10 feet to 0. Jason was instantly blinded. He reached out into the void, his hand searching for Mark's arm, but he found only the cold, empty water. The silt was so thick it felt like being buried in a landslide of gray ash. His heartbeat began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, high-pitched thrum that he could feel in his teeth. He was alone in the pitch black. The silence was absolute. Jason's flashlight beam hit the silt and reflected back into his eyes like a white wall. He couldn't see his gauges, couldn't see his hands, and couldn't tell which way was up. The narcosis was clouding his judgment, making the darkness feel like a soft, warm blanket. He felt a sudden, crushing disorientation. The water was pressing against his chest, and the taste of sulfur in his mouth was becoming overwhelming. He was spinning in a vertical desert, and the light was dead. On the surface, the boat captain watched his watch. 10 minutes had passed since Jason and Mark should have begun their ascent. He looked at the still dark water of the blue hole, his face tight with a familiar grim worry. He signaled the safety divers to get ready. In the diving world, 10 minutes is a lifetime. He knew that the blue hole didn't forgive mistakes, and it certainly didn't forgive the narcosis that lured men into its lower galleries. The atmosphere on the boat had turned from excitement to a cold, jagged fear. The technical recovery team arrived 2 hours later. These were the cowboys of the deep men who lived in the no-oxygen zones of the world's caves. They moved with a clinical detached efficiency, checking their high-pressure tanks and their redundant light systems. They dropped into the hole, moving quickly through the sapphire water and into the purple fog. They didn't look at the stalactites or the beauty of the reef. They were looking for the white tanks of the missing men in the silt. As the lead recovery diver passed the 50-meter mark, he felt the familiar pull of the narcosis. He ignored it, focusing on the beam of his light. He found the first body wedged against a limestone shelf at 60 meters. It was Mark. He was floating horizontally, his eyes open, and his regulator still in his mouth. He looked perfectly peaceful, as if he were just resting on a cloud. The cold, oxygen-free water at the bottom had preserved him, making his skin look like polished white wax in the glare of the torch. The investigation into the deaths of Jason and Mark revealed a terrifying physiological chain of events. The nitrogen narcosis had acted as a chemical wedge separating their logic from their survival instincts. When the silt-out occurred, they had lost their only anchor to the physical world, the wall of the sinkhole. In the darkness, they had likely swum deeper, believing they were heading for the surface. They had breathed their tanks dry while staring into the purple mist, victims of a biological trick played by the pressure. The clue that changed the meaning of the dive was found on Jason's dive computer. The log showed that in his final minutes, he hadn't panicked. His heart rate had remained steady and his movements were slow. He had simply sat down on a ledge in the darkness and waited. He had reached a state of total peace, a final lethal stage of the rapture, where the mind accepts the silence as home. He hadn't fought the water. He had embraced it, becoming a permanent part of the vertical desert. The climax of the recovery was the moment the divers had to bring the men through the hydrogen sulfide layer. As they rose through the purple cloud, the toxic gas seeped into the recovery team's equipment, the smell of rotten eggs becoming so intense it made them gag. They felt the shadow trying to pull them back down, as if the hole were reluctant to give up the lives it had claimed. They broke the surface into the blinding white light of the Belizean sun, the silence of the boat, a stark contrast to the roar of the deep. The truth of the blue hole shadow is that it is a trap built of physics and chemistry. The sinkhole creates a perfect environment for nitrogen narcosis to flourish, while the toxic gas layer masks the descent into the dead zone. The divers didn't die from a failure of equipment or a lack of skill. They died because the ocean offered them a version of reality that was more beautiful than the truth. They were lured into the abyss by a dream of light that existed only in their own pressurized minds. The killer in this story was the nitrogen narcosis, the rapture of the deep, which turns the instinct for survival into a desire for the dark. It is a physiological phantom that haunts every diver who crosses the 30-meter line. As of 2026, new high-resolution sonar maps of the Great Blue Hole have revealed dozens of unidentified anomalies at the very bottom, things that are likely the remains of equipment and explorers from decades past. The site remains one of the world's most famous dive destinations, but the 1998 tragedy is still used as the primary case study for narcosis training. The hole sits there, a perfect blue eye in the reef, watching the surface and waiting for the next person to look too deep. The feeling of being pulled into a space where the rules of the world no longer apply is something that stays with a person. It's a weight that you carry even after you've returned to the solid ground. For the people living on the gray plains of the Russian interior, that weight wasn't just a feeling. It was the sound of the earth itself beginning to snap a warning that the floor of their world was about to be deleted. In the deep frozen quiet of January 1997, a man named Alexei was walking through a stand of ancient black pines on the outskirts of Solikamsk, Russia. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, and the snow was so thick it muffled the sound of his own breathing. He stopped when he heard a sharp, dry crack echo through the woods. It sounded like a gunshot, but as he looked up, he saw a 50-foot pine tree simply tilt and slide into the white ground as if it were being pulled by an invisible hand. Alexei was a third-generation miner in the potash capital of the world. For him, the mines weren't just a place to work, they were the very bones of the city. He spent his days 600 meters below the surface, navigating a labyrinth of pink salt tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the schools, the churches, and the apartment blocks where his family slept. The air down there was dry and metallic, smelling of ancient dust and heavy machinery. He felt a deep, quiet pride in the industrial strength of his home. Life in Solikamsk was a hard, honest rhythm of shifts and seasons. The town was built on top of one of the largest salt deposits on the planet, the remnants of a prehistoric sea that had dried up millions of years ago. Every morning, thousands of men like Alexei would descend into the earth, their headlamps cutting through the darkness as they carved out the minerals that fueled the Russian agricultural machine. The mines provided the heat for the buildings and the money for the markets. It was a world that felt solid and permanent. To the people of the Perm region, the ground wasn't something you questioned. It was the foundation of everything they knew. They lived in sturdy brick buildings that had survived the harshest winters of the Ural Mountains. Alexei's father had told him stories of how the original tunnels were dug by prisoners decades ago, a dark history that was literally buried beneath their feet. But to the modern miners, those tunnels were just geography. They trusted the massive pillars of salt left behind to support the weight of the city, never imagining the ceiling could move. The winter of 1997 was particularly brutal. The frost had penetrated deep into the soil, turning the mud of the industrial districts into a substance as hard as iron. Alexei liked the way the cold clarified the air, making the smoke from the factory chimneys rise in perfect vertical columns of white. He would walk to the mine head every morning, the snow crunching under his heavy boots, feeling the familiar vibration of the giant ventilation fans humming in the distance. It was the heartbeat of a town that knew exactly what it was. Inside the communal apartments, life was warm and bustling. Alexei's wife would have the samovar ready when he returned from the late shift, the smell of black tea and rye bread filling their small kitchen. They would talk about the children's schoolwork or the rumors of new equipment arriving from the west. There was a sense of progress in the air, a feeling that the hard years were finally behind them. They felt a profound connection to the land, believing that the salt mines were a gift that would provide for their grandchildren just as they had for their ancestors. The landscape around Solikamsk was a patchwork of industrial towers and pristine birch forests. It was a place where nature and industry had reached a wary compromise. Alexei often spent his weekends hunting in the woods, enjoying the solitude of the high country. He knew the trails and the ridges better than he knew the city streets. To him, the forest was a place of safety, a buffer against the noise and the dust of the potash processing plants. He never looked at a stand of trees and wondered about the empty space hundreds of meters beneath their roots. In the mines, the work was grueling but predictable. Alexei operated a massive cutting machine that ate into the pink salt walls, creating tunnels that looked like high-ceilinged cathedrals. The scale of the excavation was staggering, a hollow world that mirrored the city above. He followed the maps provided by the engineers, trusting in the geological stability of the salt. He had a deep respect for the pressure of the earth, but he viewed it as a known quantity, a physical law that could be managed with enough steel and concrete. The community was bound together by the shared experience of the underground. Every family in Solikamsk had someone in the mines. When the whistle blew at the end of a shift, the streets would fill with men in dusty overalls, their faces etched with the fatigue of the deep earth. They would stop at the local kiosks for a drink and a smoke, sharing the news of the day. It was a world defined by its boundaries, the surface and the deep, the cold and the dark. Alexei felt a sense of belonging in those boundaries, a citizen of a two-story world. The first sign of disruption came in the middle of a Tuesday shift. Alexei was working in the Solikamsk 2 mine when he noticed a strange sound coming from the ceiling. It wasn't the usual groan of shifting weight. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic hissing. He stopped his machine and put his hand against the salt wall. He felt a faint, cold vibration that seemed to be pulsing through the stone. A few minutes later, he saw a thin stream of water trickling down the face of the rock. It was clear and smelled intensely of old stagnant brine. Water in a salt mine is a death sentence. Salt dissolves in water and a small leak can become a catastrophic breach in a matter of hours. Alexei reported the leak to his supervisor, but the response was one of professional dismissal. He was told it was just minor seepage from an old borehole and that the pumps would handle it. But as he walked back to the lift, he noticed that the trickle had become a flow. The air in the tunnel was becoming humid and thick, the salt beneath his boots turning into a slippery pink slush that made every step a struggle. Within 48 hours, the pressure beneath the city reached a point of no return. The small leak had become a subterranean tsunami of brine, surging through the lower levels of the mine at an incredible velocity. Alexei was evacuated, along with hundreds of other miners, as the alarms began to wail across the industrial district. He stood on the surface, watching the mine head as a low-frequency rumble began to shake the ground. It wasn't an earthquake, it was the sound of the massive salt pillars dissolving, their structural integrity being eaten away from the inside out. The panic started in the residential blocks nearest to the forest. People reported that their doors wouldn't close and that cracks were appearing in their plaster ceilings overnight. Alexei's own kitchen floor began to tilt at a slight nauseating angle. He walked back out to the woods, where he had seen the tree fall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence of the forest was gone, replaced by a sound he could only describe as the earth snapping. It was a series of loud percussive booms that echoed through the birch trees, like the world was a giant glass jar being crushed. Then the ground simply opened its mouth. A massive section of the forest floor, hundreds of meters wide, collapsed into a perfectly circular black void. It was the S1 event. Alexei stood at the edge of the new abyss, the wind from the collapse whipping his hair. He watched as a 100-year-old pine tree slid toward the edge, its roots clawing at the frozen air, before it disappeared into the pitch-black silence of the mine below. There was no dust and no roar. The earth just fell into itself, leaving a hole that looked like a portal to another dimension. The scale of the sinkhole was visually terrifying. It wasn't a slope or a pit, it was a vertical shaft that dropped straight into the flooded tunnels. Alexei could hear the sound of the brine rushing far below, a deep corrosive roar that signaled the end of the district. The local authorities cordoned off the area, but the hole continued to grow, its edges crumbling as the ground beneath them was dissolved by the rising water. The residents of the town of the damned could do nothing but watch as the boundary between the upper and lower worlds was erased in a single afternoon. The investigation into the collapse was a masterclass in corporate secrecy and industrial tragedy. Alexei watched as a team of elite mine divers arrived their gear, looking like something out of a science fiction movie. They were sent on a suicide mission into the flooded tunnels, tasked with swimming into the pitch-black corrosive brine to find the source of the breach and try to plug it with specialized cement. They moved through a world where the walls were literally melting away around them, navigating a maze that was changing shape by the minute. The divers returned with a harrowing report. The inflow was coming from an ancient unmapped aquifer that had been breached by a cutting machine weeks before. The company had known about the rising water levels, but had kept it quiet to maintain their production quotas. They had traded the safety of the city for the tonnage of the salt. Alexei felt a cold, jagged anger rising in his chest as he realized that the ground beneath his children's beds had been sold for a decimal point on a balance sheet. The town was sitting on a lid that was no longer anchored. By 1998, the S1 sinkhole had expanded to nearly 200 meters across. It had begun to swallow industrial buildings and sections of the railway line. The atmosphere in Solikamsk was one of existential dread. People would wake up in the morning and check the position of the trees in their yards to see if they had moved during the night. The sound of the earth snapping became a constant rhythmic backdrop to their lives. Every resident became a surveyor, measuring the growing cracks in their foundations with a sense of helpless, quiet terror. The clue that changed the meaning of the disaster was found in the geological logs of the old Gulag era. An independent researcher discovered that the pillars left behind in the 1950s had been intentionally thinned to increase yield, leaving the city with a safety margin that was almost non-existent. The breach wasn't an accident of nature. It was an inevitable consequence of 40 years of structural negligence. The salt wasn't just a mineral. It was the only thing holding the world up, and they had been eating away at their own foundation for decades. Alexei walked along the edge of the exclusion zone, looking at a house that was caught in a slow-motion collapse. The structure was tilting into a secondary sinkhole that had opened over the weekend. He could see a kitchen table and a chair through the broken window, perfectly ordinary objects that were about to become part of the subterranean void. The horror wasn't the speed of the destruction, but its patience. It was a slow collapse that allowed the victims to witness the erasure of their own lives, 1 inch at a time, with no way to stop the descent. The climax of the structural horror occurred when a massive industrial warehouse on the edge of the pit began to fail. Alexei watched as the heavy steel beams began to groan and twist the sound like a ship's hull snapping in a storm. The ground beneath the building didn't just sink, it dissolved into a pink, watery slush. With a final deafening boom, the entire structure slid into the abyss, disappearing into the dark water of the flooded mine below. A massive plume of corrosive mist erupted from the hole, coating the surrounding trees in salt. The sound of the collapse echoed across the city, a final signal that the district was lost. Alexei felt the vibration in the soles of his boots, a deep rhythmic thrumming that felt like the heart of the mountain was stopping. He looked at his hands and saw they were shaking not from the cold but from the realization of how fragile the world really was. He had spent his life trusting the earth, and the earth had turned out to be a hollow shell. He stood in the falling snow, a witness to the moment the floor of his world was deleted. The truth of the Solikamsk sinkhole was a reconstruction of industrial greed and geological fragility. The S1 event was a warning that the boundary between the upper and lower worlds was dangerously thin in the mining heartland of Russia. The salt mines had created a hollow world that mirrored the city, and when the water arrived, those two worlds were forced to merge. The collapse wasn't a single event, but an ongoing environmental disaster that continues to claim the landscape to this day, a wounded geography that refuses to heal. The killer in this story was the potash mineral itself, a substance that provided the city with its wealth, but also acted as its primary structural weakness. When the brine inflow hit the deep tunnels, the salt transformed from a solid foundation into a liquid corrosive trap. It was an industrial predator that used the very ground the victims lived on to consume their history. The salt was the only thing keeping the void at bay, and it simply melted away when the water arrived. As of 2026, the Perm sinkholes are world famous, with new black voids appearing as recently as 2014. Solikamsk remains a city on the edge, a place where the ground is a lid that can open at any time. Alexei and thousands of others were relocated, but the town of the damned still stands as a haunting monument to corporate negligence. The pits continue to watch the sky, swallowing the forest one tree at a time in a patient, silent erasure of the Ural mountain landscape. On the other side of the world, in a place where the ground is solid rock, but the air is a blinding wall of white, a different kind of void was already waiting. From the hollow salt of the Russian interior, we moved to a volcanic island in the middle of the sea. It was a place where the summit hides a Siberian hell that no one saw coming, turning a tropical paradise into a landscape where your own footprints can lead you to your end. In late January of 1997, a university student named Ji-hoon stood at the trailhead of Halasan on Jeju Island. The sun was a warm, golden presence overhead, casting long shadows through the palm trees that lined the parking lot. He adjusted the light day pack on his shoulders, feeling the pleasant 30-degree air against his neck. Beside him, his classmates were laughing and taking photos with their film cameras, looking more like they were headed to a beach than a 6,000-foot summit. The group was made up of 15 students and their favorite professor, a man who had spent his career studying the unique volcanic soil of the island. For these young men and women, the trip was a reward for a semester of hard work. They were from the mainland where winters were gray and biting. Jeju was their Hawaii, a place of turquoise water and volcanic wonders. They felt a sense of lightness as they started their ascent, walking on a paved trail that seemed to wind effortlessly through the greenery. Professor Kim led the way, pointing out the different types of basalt and the rare plants that only grew in the island's rich earth. He was in his late 50s and possessed a gentle, infectious enthusiasm for the mountain. The students followed his lead, their conversations filled with talk of upcoming graduation and summer plans. They were wearing light windbreakers and denim clothes that were perfectly suited for the temperate breeze blowing off the coast. As they climbed higher, the paved path gave way to a series of wooden stairs and rocky outcrops. The tropical trees began to disappear, replaced by gnarled, stunted bushes that clung to the dark volcanic rock. Ji-hoon noticed that the air was getting thinner and the temperature was dropping, but it felt refreshing after the humidity of the base. They stopped at a small viewpoint to share some fruit and water, looking down at the coastline, far below where the surf looked like a thin line of lace. There were other hikers on the trail, mostly tourists in colorful gear, who nodded as they passed. The atmosphere was festive and social. Ji-hoon felt a deep bond with his classmates, a shared history of long nights in the library and stressful exams. This mountain was their final hurdle together, a physical manifestation of the transition from students to adults. They felt a collective strength in their numbers, a belief that nothing could go wrong as long as they stayed together as a group. The professor checked his watch and noted that they were making excellent time. He encouraged them to keep a steady pace, wanting to reach the crater before the afternoon clouds rolled in. Ji-hoon looked up at the summit, which sat like a jagged crown against the deep blue sky. It looked close enough to touch. He felt a surge of adrenaline and stepped onto the next basalt ledge. The world felt vast and full of potential, and the mountain seemed like a silent, welcoming host. By early afternoon, they had reached the 5,000-foot mark. The vegetation had vanished entirely, leaving a stark, alien landscape of black rock and gray volcanic ash. The wind had picked up a steady, low-frequency hum that vibrated in the rocks. Ji-hoon noticed that the sun no longer felt warm. It was a cold, distant light that provided no comfort. He zipped up his light jacket and tucked his hands into his pockets, noticing that a few of his friends were beginning to shiver. The first offbeat detail appeared as a thin horizontal line of white on the northern horizon. It didn't look like a cloud, it looked like a wall. Ji-hoon watched it for a moment, wondering if it was just a trick of the light. But within minutes, the vibrant blue of the sky was replaced by a dull, opaque gray. The air didn't just get colder, it turned into a substance that felt like ice. A low-pitched roar began to echo from the summit, a sound like a freight train moving across the jagged ridges above them. The blue sky blizzard hit the group with the force of a physical explosion. In less than 60 seconds, visibility dropped from miles to a few feet. The sun was erased, leaving the students in a disorienting, featureless white void. The wind was so strong it knocked several people to their knees, the frozen volcanic grit stinging their faces like shards of glass. Ji-hoon reached out for the person in front of him, but his hand found only the freezing air. The trail beneath their boots simply disappeared. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. Ji-hoon could hear the professor's voice over the roar of the gale shouting for everyone to huddle together. They moved by touch, their fingers numb and useless as they fumbled for each other's jackets. The light denim and thin windbreakers were no match for the Arctic air that was now pouring over the summit. They were trapped in a whiteout, a condition where the sky and the ground merge into a single blinding wall that destroys all sense of balance. 3 days later, a rescue team from the Jeju Coast Guard moved slowly across the high plateau near the Bangnok Dam crater. They were wearing heavy insulated suits and using long probes to feel through the 3 feet of fresh snow that covered the black rocks. The sun was back, but the silence was absolute. The lead rescuer stopped when his probe hit something solid and rhythmic beneath a large snowdrift. He signaled for the others to bring the shovels, his face tight, with the expectation of what they were about to find. As they cleared the snow, they discovered a sight that would become a part of the island's dark folklore. They found a single frozen mass of human bodies. The students had formed a tight circle, huddled together in a desperate attempt to share their fading body heat. In the center of the huddle was the professor, his students, having used their own bodies to create a human wall to protect him from the wind. They were perfectly preserved by the cold, their faces turned inward toward the center of the mass. The investigation into the disaster began with the tracking of the group's final movements. The searchers found a series of deep rhythmic footprints that emerged from the snow near a small emergency shelter. The shelter was a sturdy stone building, equipped with a heater and supplies designed specifically for these kinds of events. It was located only 500 meters from where the bodies were found. The rescuers realized with a jolt of horror that the students had spent their final hours in the immediate vicinity of safety. The footprints told a tragic story of spatial disorientation. The students hadn't just wandered aimlessly, they had walked in 3 perfect tightening circles. In the total whiteout of the blizzard, they had lost their ability to walk in a straight line. Without a landmark to fix their eyes on, their own bodies had pulled them in a natural arc. They had walked past the entrance to the warm shelter 3 separate times, sometimes missing the stone wall by only a dozen feet before their energy finally gave out. The twist in the case was found in the red university flag Jihoon had been carrying in his pack. The rescuers found the flag staked into the ice a few yards from the huddle. It was a final desperate marker, an attempt to signal for help in a world where no one could see more than an arm's length away. The students had done everything right. They stayed together, they protected their elder, and they tried to mark their position. But the mountain had moved the landmarks, turning a 500-meter walk into an infinite lethal maze. The climax of their struggle was the moment the internal temperature of the huddle began to fail. As the students fell into the final stages of hypothermia, they likely experienced a sensation of extreme heat, a common physiological glitch that causes victims to shed their clothing in their final minutes. The rescuers found that several of the students had unzipped their windbreakers, exposing their skin to the 30 below wind. They had died believing they were burning up, even as the moisture in their lungs was turning to ice. The truth of the Halasan blizzard was a reconstruction of a terrain bait-and-switch. The group had been lured into a false sense of security by the tropical base of the island, a deception that prevented them from carrying the heavy gear required for a 6,000-foot volcanic summit. Halasan acts as a lightning rod for storms moving across the Sea of Japan, causing them to dump their entire energy on the crater instantly. The students weren't killed by a lack of skill, but by a microclimate that turned paradise into Siberia in seconds. The killer in this case was the whiteout itself, a psychological phantom that erases the horizon and forces the human brain to walk in circles. It is a sensory void that can turn a distance of 500 meters into a death sentence, even when a warm room is just out of sight. As of 2026, Jeju Island has implemented a mandatory permit and gear check system for all summit hikers. Heated emergency bunkers are now visible every 2 kilometers along the trail, each one equipped with a strobe light and a high-frequency siren that can be heard even in the roar of a blizzard. The 1997 tragedy remains the island's most solemn lesson. The frozen students are remembered with a small stone marker near the crater, a place where the air is still cold and the sky is a deep, deceptive blue. In the late winter of 1997, a volunteer searcher with the Icelandic Association for Search and Rescue, or ISAR, was standing on a vast, featureless plateau of ice. The Vatnajökull glacier stretched out in every direction, a white, undulating sea that covered over 8% of the entire country. The air was so cold it felt like it was crystallizing inside his lungs, and the wind was a constant low-frequency hum that vibrated in the fiberglass hull of his specialized snow truck. The ranger, a man named Gunnar who had spent 20 years navigating the ice, stepped out of the vehicle and looked at the ground. There, preserved in a patch of hard-packed crust, was a single line of footprints. They were the distinct, jagged marks of mountaineering crampons, spaced in a rhythmic, determined stride. He followed them for 20 yards until they reached a narrow, blue-tinted fissure in the ice. At the very edge of the crack, the footprints simply stopped, as if the person wearing them had walked directly into the sky. Julien was a 32-year-old engineer from Chamonix, France, who viewed the world through the precise, geometric lens of a structural designer. He lived in the shadow of Mont Blanc, a place where the mountains were a daily presence, but for him they were a source of data to be understood. He spent his weekends climbing the technical granite spires of the Alps, not for the adrenaline, but for the clarity that came from calculating the exact tension of a rope or the load-bearing capacity of a snow anchor. His climbing partner Mark was a 35-year-old mountain guide who possessed a restless kinetic energy that complemented Julien's stillness. Mark was a man of the high places, someone who felt more at home in a bivouac sack at 4,000 meters than in a crowded Parisian cafe. He had a deep intuitive understanding of the weather and the way snow changed its texture with the rising sun. Together they were a perfectly balanced unit, a team that had navigated the most dangerous faces of the Eiger and the Matterhorn without a single major incident. The two men had spent 3 years planning their expedition to the Vatnajökull. To them, the glacier wasn't just an ice cap, it was a white hole, a place so vast and featureless that it challenged the human brain's ability to process space. They wanted to perform a winter traverse of the plateau, a distance of over 100 kilometers, where they would see no rocks, no trees, and no signs of human life. It was the ultimate test of their navigation and their endurance in a world of infinite white. Julian had spent months researching the glaciology of the region. He studied the satellite imagery of the crevasses and the flow rates of the different ice tongues that spilled off the plateau toward the sea. He knew that the Vatnajökull sat on top of several active volcanoes, a hidden heat that created a strange, unstable architecture beneath the surface. He felt a profound sense of competence in his ability to read the ice, believing that his engineering background would allow him to navigate the living entity of the glacier. They arrived in Reykjavik in early March, hauling 2 heavy plastic sleds called polkas that contained their entire world. The sleds were packed with the precision of a laboratory filled with high-calorie freeze-dried meals, a sturdy 4-season tent, and rolls of specialized climbing rope. They spent their first night in a small guest house checking their gear one last time. The atmosphere was one of quiet, professional focus. They weren't there for glory, they were there for the experience of the silence. The initial days of the traverse were a rhythmic, meditative experience. The men moved in a straight line, their skis making a soft, rhythmic hissing sound against the dry, powdery snow. They were tethered together by a 30-meter rope, a lifeline that ensured if one fell into a hidden crack, the other could anchor them. The scale of the glacier was staggering. The horizon was a perfect flat line, where the white ground met the pale blue sky, making it feel like they were walking across the top of a giant marble. Life on the ice was dictated by the simple necessities of survival. Every evening they would use their snow shovels to carve out a protected pit for their tent, building up high walls to block the wind. They would melt ice for water, their small stove humming in the corner of the vestibule, and talk about the distance they had covered. Mark would tell stories of his climbs in the Andes, while Julian would explain the physics of the ice flow beneath their feet. They felt a deep, resonant bond in the isolation. Julian found a strange comfort in the uniformity of the landscape. Without any landmarks to judge distance, his internal sense of time began to shift. A kilometer felt like 100, and an hour felt like a minute. He spent his days watching the back of Mark's jacket, focusing on the steady, alternating movement of his friend's legs. The only colors in their world were the red of their anoraks and the deep neon blue shadows inside the small fissures they carefully stepped over. The weather for the first week was uncharacteristically stable. The sun was a cold, bright presence that turned the glacier into a field of diamonds. They were making excellent time, covering 20 kilometers a day. They felt untouchable in their high-altitude sanctuary, a feeling of safety that comes from being perfectly prepared for a known environment. They had a satellite phone and a radio, and they checked in with the Ice Sar Rangers every 48 hours, reporting their coordinates and their progress. Mark often spoke about the glacier as if it were a conscious thing, a slow-moving giant that was indifferent to their presence. He told Julian about the molens, the vertical shafts carved by meltwater that could drop hundreds of meters straight down into the heart of the ice. He cautioned Julian to always keep his harness on, even when they were inside the tent. Julian nodded his engineering mind, calculating the probability of a collapse, but the ice beneath them felt as solid as the granite of Chamonix. The first offbeat detail occurred on the morning of the 9th day. Julian noticed that the wind had changed direction, moving from a steady northern breeze to a sharp, erratic gust from the east. The sky was no longer blue. It had turned a dull, opaque gray that seemed to merge with the horizon. A low-frequency vibration began to rumble through the soles of his boots, a sound like a distant freight train. The barometer on his wristwatch began to drop with a speed he had never seen in the Alps. By noon, the dry blizzard had arrived. This wasn't a storm of falling snow. It was a blinda where the wind picks up the loose, powdery ice from the surface and turns the air into a blinding wall of white. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 5 feet. Julian couldn't see the horizon or the ground beneath his skis. He could only see the rope leading to Mark, a thin red line that was vibrating violently in the gale. The world had become a featureless void of noise and ice. They decided to stop and pitch their tent immediately, realizing that moving forward in the whiteout was a recipe for disaster. They fought the wind for an hour, their fingers turning numb inside their mittens as they struggled to secure the snow anchors. The wind was hitting them with the force of 150 kilometers an hour, a pressure that made it difficult to draw a full breath. They finally managed to crawl inside the tent, the fabric snapping and popping above their heads like a series of gunshots. The pressure inside the tent was intense. The wind was so loud they had to shout to be heard over the roar. Julian watched the tent poles, which were made of high-strength aluminum, bowing inward under the weight of the gale. He felt a sharp, jagged anxiety rising in his chest, a realization that their engineering and their planning were being tested by a force that didn't follow the rules of the mountain. They were trapped in a small nylon bubble in the middle of a white hell. As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero, and the moisture from their breath began to freeze on the inside of the tent walls, raining down on them as fine, icy dust. Mark sat in the corner, his arms wrapped around his knees, listening to the groaning of the ice cap beneath them. He told Julian that they needed to step out and secure a secondary line to their polkas, fearing the wind would blow their supplies into a crevasse. Julian watched as Mark prepared to step out into the whiteout. Mark tied a safety line to the main tent pole and clipped it to his harness. He opened the zipper of the vestibule, and the wind instantly filled the tent with a swirling cloud of ice. Mark stepped out into the void, his red anorak disappearing into the white wall in a matter of seconds. Julian held the rope, feeling the steady, rhythmic tugs as Mark moved toward the sleds. He waited, his heart thundering against his ribs. Suddenly, the rope went slack. Julian pulled on it, expecting to feel the weight of his friend, but there was no resistance. He shouted Mark's name, his voice swallowed by the roar of the blizzard. He waited for a minute, then two, his fingers trembling as he clutched the nylon cord. He realized with a jolt of ice in his stomach that the primary tent pole had snapped under a sudden gust and the safety line had slipped through the broken fitting. Mark was gone, separated from the tent in a world with no landmarks. Julian didn't hesitate. He knew that in a whiteout a person can die of exposure or walk off a cliff in less than 5 minutes. He grabbed his own safety line, anchored it to the remains of the sled, and stepped out into the gale. The wind hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air out of his lungs. He couldn't see his own hands. He began to crawl in the direction Mark had gone, his fingers clawing at the frozen crust of the glacier. He was screaming Mark's name into the dark. He crawled for 30 yards, his sense of direction completely erased by the noise and the whiteout. He felt a sudden, sickening drop in the ground beneath his knees. He reached out his hand, hitting a smooth, vertical wall of blue ice. He realized he was at the edge of a moulin, a vertical drainage shaft that dropped hundreds of meters into the dark heart of the glacier. He looked down into the hole, but there was only a swirling mist and the sound of the wind hissing through the ice. Julian spent the rest of the night huddled in the ruins of the tent, his body shaking from the final stages of hypothermia. He had lost his friend, his supplies, and his sense of reality. When the storm finally broke the next morning, the Ice Saw Rangers found the campsite. They found the shredded remains of the tent and the 2 polkas, but they found no sign of the men. The footprints Julian had left at the edge of the moulin were the only evidence of their final moments. The search and rescue operation was a massive, week-long effort. Elite climbers rappelled down into the moulin where the tracks stopped, but the shaft was a 3-dimensional maze of ice and water that had no bottom. They used high-powered lights to peer into the depths, but the blue ice absorbed the beams, leaving them in a dark, silent void. The Rangers realized that the men hadn't just fallen. They had been swallowed by a living entity that was constantly moving and changing shape. The investigation into the disappearance revealed a terrifying glaciological reality. The Vatnajökull is not a static block of ice. It is a river that flows at a rate of several centimeters every day. Because the men had fallen into a central drainage shaft, their remains were now part of the glacier's internal conveyor belt. They weren't sitting at the bottom of a hole. They were traveling inside the ice, moving slowly but surely toward the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, miles away from where they had died. The clue that changed the meaning of the search was found by a team of scientists studying the glacier's flow. They realized that any artifacts or remains trapped in that specific moulin would likely not emerge at the snout of the glacier for another 50 to 100 years. The men were now in a moving grave, a tomb made of ice that was transporting them across the country. They had sought the infinite white to find silence, and the glacier had given them a journey that would last a century. The climax of the story is found in the sensory experience of the blinda. In a whiteout, the human brain loses its ability to distinguish between the sky and the ground, leading to a phenomenon called spatial disorientation. Julian and Mark hadn't made a mistake in their planning. They had been victims of a biological failure triggered by the environment. Their own eyes had betrayed them, making a vertical drop look like a flat path. They had walked into the sky because the ice had erased the horizon. The truth of the Vatnajökull white hole is a reconstruction of a world where the ground is never still. The glacier sitting on top of the volcanoes creates a unique, unstable geography where a campsite can be safe 1 hour and a trap the next. The men were captured by a natural machine that operates on a scale of time and distance that the human mind can't fully comprehend. They became a part of the ice they had spent years studying, a permanent addition to the white silence of the north. The killer in this story was the Vatnajökull itself, a moving ice cap that uses the blinda to lure travelers into its hidden shafts. It is an environmental predator that erases footprints and stores its victims in a frozen horizontal transit toward the sea. As of 2026, the Vatnajökull is melting at a record pace due to the warming of the Atlantic. Glaciologists believe that the 97 artifacts in the remains of Julian and Mark may begin to emerge near the Jökulsárlón Lagoon much sooner than originally predicted, perhaps within the next decade. The glacier continues to groan at night, a deep metallic boom that sounds like a ship's hull snapping, reminding the rangers that the ice is always moving and it never forgets what it has taken. Sometimes the world stays the same, and it's just our perception of it that changes. But other times you can be in a paradise where the trees are lush and the air is warm, and you still find yourself freezing to death in a whiteout that shouldn't exist. It's all a matter of how high you climb. In the early morning hours of January 4th, 1998, a young man named Luis was standing on a high, rocky ridge in the Talamanca range of Costa Rica. He was 3,800 meters above sea level, and the world around him was making a sound he didn't recognize. The wind was pushing through the stunted prehistoric palms of the summit, but they didn't rustle or sway. Instead, the frozen fronds were clinking together with a high-pitched rhythmic sound, like thousands of shards of glass hitting each other in the dark. Luis adjusted his grip on his light nylon backpack, his fingers feeling thick and unresponsive. To his left, the trail back down the mountain had been erased by a thick, opaque wall of spectral white fog. To his right, the jagged peaks of the creststones rose like black teeth against a gray sky. The air didn't smell like the damp, warm jungle he had left at the base of the mountain. It smelled like frozen slate and ozone. He realized then that the environment had shifted into something fundamentally hostile. Luis was a 21-year-old biology student at the University of Costa Rica in San Jose. He was a man who lived for the details of the natural world, spending his weeks in the laboratory and his weekends in the cloud forests. He was the kind of person who could identify a rare orchid by its scent and track the movements of a quetzal through the canopy. To Luis, the mountains were a giant open-air classroom, a place where everything had a name and a specific logical reason for existing. His hiking companions were his 3 closest friends from the university. There was Mateo, a mountain runner with endless energy, Sofia, who was studying environmental law, and Elena, a quiet, observant geologist. They were a group defined by their youth and their shared belief that they understood the landscape of their own country. They had grown up in the valley of the Central Plateau, where the weather was a constant, comfortable spring. To them, the peaks were just a higher version of home. The trip to Cerro Chirripó was meant to be their final celebration before the new semester began. They had planned the hike for months, looking at topographical maps and coordinating their transportation to the trailhead at San Gerardo de Rivas. Luis had meticulously checked their supplies, but his list was built for the tropics. He packed extra water, light snacks, and sun protection. In his mind, the challenge of the mountain was the vertical gain and the physical exertion, not the weather. Sofia and Elena had spent the days before the trip shopping for lightweight trekking clothes. They bought bright, colorful t-shirts and breathable nylon shorts, the kind of gear you see in professional outdoor catalogs. Mateo had focused on his footwear breaking in a pair of high-end trail runners that were designed for speed on the steep, muddy slopes of the lower forest. They felt professional and capable, a group of modern adventurers who were ready to conquer the highest point in their nation. As they drove toward the Talamanca Range, the atmosphere in the car was one of infectious excitement. They spoke about the view from the summit, where on a clear day you can see both the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea at the same time. They joked about the Sky Island ecosystems. They were about to enter areas of the mountain so isolated that they had evolved their own unique species of plants and animals. They felt a profound sense of ownership over the geography of their island. Their journey began at the base of the mountain, where the heat was a heavy, humid presence. The first few miles of the trail wound through a lush, vibrant rainforest filled with the sound of cicadas and the distant calls of howler monkeys. They moved quickly, their light gear, allowing them to maintain a steady, athletic pace. Luis felt a surge of pride in his friends as they navigated the steep switchbacks, their laughter echoing through the canopy. The mountain felt like a welcoming, familiar friend. By the second day, they had passed through the cloud forest and entered the subalpine zone known as the Paramo. The trees were shorter now, gnarled and covered in thick mats of moss that looked like gray hair. The air was thinner and cooler, a refreshing change from the damp heat of the lowlands. They set up their camp at a designated shelter, eating a simple meal and watching the stars. They felt a deep, resonant sense of peace in the isolation, unaware that the rules were about to change. In the late 90s, the mountain was a place of relative safety for those who stayed on the trails. The community of Baquianos, the local guides who lived at the base, were the guardians of the peaks. They were men who could navigate the ridges by the smell of the air alone, and they often warned hikers about the unpredictable nature of the summit. But to Luis and his friends, these warnings felt like old stories, relics of a time before high-tech maps and synthetic fabrics. The transition from the ordinary to the unthinkable occurred at exactly 10 o'clock on the third morning. The group was standing near the summit, preparing for their final push to the peak. The sun had been out only minutes before, but now the sky was a dull, bruised shade of gray. A freak cold front triggered by an unusual La Niña weather event had collided with the moisture-rich air of the Caribbean. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a matter of seconds, turning the mist into ice. Luis watched as a layer of rime ice began to form on the surface of Elena's backpack. It looked like a fine white fur that grew in the direction of the wind. He tried to speak, but his jaw felt tight and sluggish. The wind wasn't just cold, it was violent, a sustained force that made it difficult to maintain their balance on the jagged rocks. Sophia reached for her windbreaker, but her fingers were so numb she couldn't pull the zipper. The tropical paradise had been replaced by a Siberian hell. The pressure of the environment was absolute. Within 30 minutes, the trail back to the shelter had vanished under a layer of frozen fog. They were standing in a whiteout, a sensory void where the ground and the sky were the same featureless color. Luis felt a sharp, jagged anxiety rising in his chest. They were wearing shorts and light shirts gear that offered zero protection against the sub-zero wind chill. He realized that the Sky Island had become an Arctic prison, and they were the only inmates. They decided to keep moving, believing that if they could just find the main trail, they could run back down to the warmth of the forest. But the Paramo is a natural maze. The stunted trees all looked identical in the fog, and the volcanic rocks offered no landmarks. They began to walk in circles, their footprints in the frost leading them back to the same gnarled trunk over and over again. Luis felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, high-pitched thrum that he could feel in his teeth. Back at the San Gerardo trailhead, the families of the students were beginning to worry. They had expected a check-in call by the evening of the fourth day, but the mountain had remained silent. The Baquianos noted the unusual frost on the lower peaks and knew that the conditions at the summit would be lethal. A search was launched led by local rangers and international teams who were unaccustomed to performing mountain rescues in freezing conditions in the middle of Costa Rica. The investigation into the search revealed the psychological breakdown that occurs in the final stages of hypothermia. The rangers found what they called rabbit tracks, a series of panicked, chaotic footprints in the rime ice that showed the students had been running in small, tight circles. They were experiencing spatial disorientation, a condition where the brain loses its ability to process direction. To the students, the world had become a shifting vertical void, with no exit and no bottom. The international rescue teams coordinated with the local guides using GPS and high-altitude gear that was rarely used in the region. They focused their efforts on the Ventisqueros Valley, a place where the wind was funneled into a freezing corridor. The atmosphere was one of grim, focused intensity. The searchers knew that every hour the students spent in the cold was another hour closer to a total physiological failure. The mountain was a landscape that punished curiosity with a clinical white silence. The break in the case came on the third day of the search. A local guide, moving by the scent of the air, noticed a faint rhythmic sound coming from a dense thicket of gnarled oaks. He pushed through the frozen branches and found a single massive tree that had been hollowed out by a prehistoric fire. Inside the trunk, huddled together in a single mass of shivering bodies, were the 4 students. They were barely conscious, their skin a pale waxy blue in the dim light of the fog. The twist that had saved their lives was a desperate form of survival MacGyverism. When they realized they couldn't find the trail, Luis had remembered an old lecture about the caloric density of raw coffee beans. He had a small bag of unroasted beans in his pack that he had bought as a souvenir for his mother. For 3 days, the group had huddled in the hollow tree, eating the bitter hard beans to keep their metabolisms running while they shared their fading body heat. The climax of the rescue was a race against the final stage of hypothermia. As the rangers carried the students down the steep switchbacks, they noticed that Sophia and Elena were beginning to experience paradoxical undressing. Their brains, confused by the cold, were telling them they were burning up. The searchers had to physically restrain them to keep them from shedding their light clothes in the 30-degree wind. It was a recovery done in a state of absolute urgency, moving from the Arctic summit to the tropical base. The truth of the Cerro Chirripó whiteout is a reconstruction of a terrain bait-and-switch. The group had been lured into a false sense of security by the geography of their own country, unaware that a mountain is not just a height, but a different climate entirely. The Sky Island had acted as a natural trap, catching a freak cold front and holding it on the summit like a lethal secret. The students hadn't made a mistake in their character, they had made a mistake in their physics. The killer in this story was the Paramo fog, a sensory phantom that erases the path and turns the cold into a psychological weapon. It is an environmental predator that uses the beauty of the tropics to mask a Siberian lethality. The students survived, not because of their gear, but because of a hollow tree and a bag of raw coffee beans, a miracle of survival in a place where the palm fronds sound like breaking glass. Luis never looked at a topographical map the same way again. As of 2026, the Cerro Chirripó National Park enforces a mandatory gear check for all hikers entering the subalpine zone. No one is allowed to ascend without insulated layers and emergency navigation tools, regardless of the temperature at the base. The 1998 tragedy remains a staple of local trekking warnings, a reminder of the day the tropics turned white. The mountain continues to watch the sea, a silent vertical sentinel that keeps its own weather. Sometimes the thing that saves you isn't the strength of your muscles or the precision of your plan. It's the realization that the world is bigger than your definitions, and that the only way forward is to stop moving and wait for the light. On a different peak where the rock is red and the peaks are like a crown, the light was about to turn into a singing wire. It was 6 o'clock on a late August evening in 1998, and the north peak of Mount Ushba was beginning to bleed. The setting sun hit the massive granite face at an angle that turned the rock from a dull industrial gray into a deep, saturated crimson. This was the famous Red Wall, a 2,000-foot vertical spire in the Caucasus Mountains of Georgia that looked less like a mountain and more like a jagged, double-headed crown. The air was thin and perfectly still, carrying nothing but the faint metallic scent of sun-warmed stone. Georgie was 31 years old and had spent the last 15 years looking up at this peak from the valley of Svaneti. He was a man of the high country with hands that were permanently calloused and a face that had been etched by the harsh mountain sun. To him, Ushba wasn't just a destination or a technical challenge. It was a living, breathing neighbor. He grew up in the village of Mestia, surrounded by medieval stone towers that were built centuries ago to protect his ancestors from invaders and the jealous whims of the mountain. The climb was an elite undertaking, a route that only a handful of people in the world were qualified to attempt. Georgie moved with a rhythmic, economical grace, his boots finding small crystalline edges in the granite that a normal person wouldn't even be able to see. He felt a profound sense of connection to the rock, a physical dialogue that had been passed down through generations of Svaneti guides. Every placement of a piton and every shift of his weight was a calculated, respectful question asked of a peak that was known for its quick and violent temper. His climbing partners were two of the best in the region, men who understood that on Ushba your equipment is your only link to the living world. They had spent weeks in the valley below, preparing their gear with the obsessive focus of surgeons. They checked the tension of their ropes, the sharpness of their ice axes, and the structural integrity of their anchors. They were a team defined by their silence and their shared understanding that at 4,000 meters there is no room for a single unforced error. The atmosphere in the Svaneti region is one of ancient brooding permanence. The villages are tucked into deep green valleys where the sound of rushing meltwater is constant. For Georgi, the ascent began long before they hit the rock. It started in the quiet mornings in Mestia, drinking strong tea and listening to the elders tell stories of Dali, the golden-haired goddess of the hunt, who was said to guard the crags of Ushba. They believed the mountain demanded a sacrifice every decade, a superstition Georgi dismissed with the logic of a modern climber. Despite his technical training, Georgi couldn't help but feel the weight of that history as they climbed higher into the vertical void. The red wall was so steep that they couldn't see the ground anymore. They could only see the curvature of the earth and the distant white-capped peaks of the Russian border. They were living in a world of granite and sky hanging by their fingertips over a drop that was nearly half a mile of empty air. The silence was absolute, a heavy pressurized quiet that felt like it was waiting for something to happen. Their routine was a masterclass in high-altitude efficiency. They climbed in shifts, one man leading, while the others managed the safety lines and hauled the heavy bags of supplies. They ate small, high-calorie meals while clipped into hanging harnesses, their feet dangling over the abyss. They spoke in low-clipped sentences, focusing entirely on the technical geometry of the route. Georgi felt a deep, resonant pride in the way his team operated. They were a single, synchronized machine moving through a landscape that was fundamentally hostile to human life. The granite of the North Peak was beautiful but unforgiving. It was a hard, crystalline rock that didn't crumble or give way, but it offered very few cracks for protection. Every few yards, Georgi would have to hammer a steel piton into a hair-thin fissure, the high-pitched ping of the metal echoing off the walls like a bell. He lived for that sound. It was the sound of a secure anchor, the sound of a plan working exactly as it was intended. He felt a sense of mastery over the vertical world, a belief that skill could conquer gravity. By the third day of the ascent, they had reached the middle of the red wall. They were tired, their muscles screaming from the constant isometric tension, but their spirits were high. They had navigated the most difficult sections of the Kustov route and were only a few hundred meters from the ridge that led to the summit. The weather had been perfect, a rare string of clear days in a mountain range known for its bipolar shifts. Georgi allowed himself a moment of optimism, looking out at the vast, jagged horizon of the Caucasus. He thought about his family back in the valley, imagining them looking up at the peak and seeing the tiny, colorful specks of their jackets against the crimson rock. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life he had chosen. He wasn't a man who belonged in an office or a city. He was a man who needed the perspective that only comes from standing on a ledge that is only a few inches wide. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, a Svaneti climber reclaiming the crown of his ancestors. The first offbeat detail occurred just after 4 o'clock. Georgi noticed that the air had changed its texture. It was no longer dry and thin. It felt heavy and tasted faintly of scorched metal. He looked toward the west and saw that the vibrant blue of the sky was being replaced by a dull, charcoal-gray fog that seemed to be rising from the valleys rather than falling from the clouds. The wind, which had been a steady breeze, suddenly stopped. The silence became so thick that he could hear the sound of his own heart beating in his ears. Then came the sound. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't the wind. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to be coming from the very rock Georgi was touching. He looked at his ice axe, which was clipped to his harness, and saw that the metal was glowing with a faint, ghostly blue light. He reached out to adjust a safety line, and a bright spark jumped from his finger to the carabiner, accompanied by a sharp electric pop. The mountain wasn't just changing its weather, it was charging itself like a massive battery. The pressure in the air was shifting with a speed that made Georgi's vision blur. He realized with a jolt of ice in his stomach that they were standing on a lightning rod. The singing wire sound was getting louder, a high-frequency buzz that made the hair on his arms stand straight up. He looked at his partners, their faces pale and wide-eyed in the strange metallic light. They were trapped on a vertical face of granite with thousands of pounds of metal gear, and the sky was about to strike. Within minutes, the first lightning bolt hit the ridge above them. The sound was a physical explosion that knocked the wind out of Georgie's lungs and left his ears ringing with a high-pitched static. He saw sparks jumping between the pitons in the wall, a terrifying display of energy that turned their safety system into a conduit for death. They needed to descend immediately, but there was no way to move fast enough on a vertical wall. They were anchored to the very thing that was trying to kill them. Panic began to claw at the edges of the group's discipline. They started a frantic, hurried rappel, trying to get off the exposed ridge and into the gully of death below. Georgie took the lead, his hands trembling as he fed the rope through his descent device. The metal was so hot from the static charge that it burned through his gloves, but he didn't stop. He pushed off the wall, dropping 20 feet at a time in a desperate race against the next strike. The red wall was no longer a beautiful neighbor. It was a jealous deity. The search and rescue pilots from the Russian side of the border were the first to see the aftermath. From the cockpit of their high-altitude helicopter, they looked at the red wall through a pair of stabilized binoculars. They saw a line of ropes dangling from a series of anchors halfway up the face. At the bottom of those ropes, caught on a narrow snow-covered ledge in the gully, were the colorful shapes of the climbers. They weren't moving. The pilots could see that the ropes had been blackened by heat. The investigation into the technical failure revealed a nightmare of physics. As the team had rappelled in a panic, the static electricity in the air had magnetized their metal gear, causing the ropes to twist and bind. When the next lightning strike hit the ridge, the surge of power had traveled down the wet nylon lines like a fuse. The first piton in the sequence hadn't just pulled out of the rock, it had shattered under the thermal stress. This triggered a zipper fall where every safety anchor failed in a rapid explosive sequence. The twist that haunted the families for years was the geopolitical delay. Because the climbers were on the Georgian side, but the only helicopter capable of the rescue was in Russia. The two governments spent 12 hours arguing over flight permits and border protocols. For a full night, the survivors of the initial fall lay on the ledge in the gully of death, watching the lights of the search teams in the valley below. By the time the Russian pilots were finally cleared to cross the border, the cold and the injuries had finished what the lightning started. The climax of the tragedy was the final retrieval from the ledge. The pilots had to hover with their blades only feet away from the granite walls, fighting the unpredictable updrafts of the canyon. They described the scene as a shattered ridge, a place where the mountain had physically rejected the climbers. The singing wire was still audible in the air as they moved the bodies, a lingering reminder of the static charge that had turned a technical masterpiece into a vertical slaughter. The mountain had taken its sacrifice. The truth of the Red Wall of Ushba was a reconstruction of a catastrophe born of static electricity and gravity. The climbers hadn't made a technical mistake. They had been victims of a rare atmospheric event that turned their own safety gear into a lethal weapon. The Svaneti culture's belief that the mountain was a jealous living entity felt less like a superstition and more like a biological fact. Ushba didn't just have cliffs, it had a voice, and that voice was a hum that signaled the end. The killer in this story was the static electricity, a natural force that turned the red wall into a massive vertical circuit. It was a predator that waited for the perfect alignment of weather and geography to strike the most elite climbers in the Caucasus. As of 2026, Mount Ushba remains one of the most difficult and dangerous climbs in the world. The Kustov route is still known as the Shattered Ridge, and professional guides warn every new team about the singing wire phenomenon. The Svaneti people still build their stone towers in the valley, and they still look up at the double-headed peak with a mix of pride and a very specific kind of fear. The red wall still glows every evening at sunset, a beautiful blood-red crown that hides its secrets in the mist. We have walked through 14 different lives tonight, and if you listen closely to the rain hitting the glass, you might notice that the world feels a little thinner than it did an hour ago. There is a specific kind of silence that follows these accounts. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of realization. We have spent the last few hours looking at the exact moment where the ordinary world decided to stop making sense for someone. The most disturbing thread through all of these stories isn't the presence of a killer or the fury of a storm. It is the overwhelming normalcy of the settings before everything went sideways. We tend to look for horror in the shadows, expecting it to wear a mask or carry a weapon. But the truth we've seen tonight is that the most profound terror doesn't hide in the dark. It hides in the things we use and the places we trust every single day. Think about the blue garbage bags found on the banks of the Haine in Belgium. They weren't exotic or strange. They were the same mass-produced items you have tucked under your kitchen sink. The horror wasn't just in what they contained, but in the fact that a predator could use something so mundane to package the unthinkable. He didn't need a secret lair. He used the city's own trash system as a stage, hiding his darkness in plain sight of the neighbors. It is the same feeling of betrayal we see in the white minivan abandoned in the California desert. A rental car is a symbol of freedom and modern reliability. It is a high-tech bubble designed to keep the elements at bay. To the Rimkus family, that van was a piece of home they took into the wilderness. The tragedy wasn't just the heat. It was the slow, agonizing realization that their shield had become a cage, and their map had become a series of lies. We live our lives based on a set of unspoken contracts with the world around us. We trust that the ground beneath our feet is solid, that the water in the river flows forward, and that a line on a map represents a path to safety. We rely on these assumptions to keep our sanity. But as we saw in the salt mines of Solikamsk, the ground is often just a lid. The floor you walk on today is only solid because the void beneath it hasn't decided to open yet. The people in these stories weren't looking for danger. They were tourists on vacation, students on a field trip, or fishermen doing the same job their grandfathers did. They were operating within the framework of a normal day. Horror is most effective when it is a slow-motion transition, a gradual shift where the shortcut you took starts to look less like a road and more like a trap. It is the moment you realize the environment has stopped being a backdrop. There is a specific kind of arrogance in our relationship with nature. We believe that because we have GPS satellite phones and synthetic fabrics, we have conquered the wild. But the Vatnajökull Glacier and the Blue Mountains don't care about your technology. They function on a geological timescale that doesn't account for human life. The horror comes when we realize that our advanced gear is just a thin layer of nylon against a world that is fundamentally lethal. In the case of the frozen students on Jeju Island, the tragedy was rooted in the deception of a paradise. They looked at the palm trees at the base of the mountain and assumed the summit would be the same. They trusted the tropical label of the island. The mountain didn't have to hunt them. It just had to wait for them to climb high enough for the air to turn into a wall. They died 500 meters from warmth because their own eyes couldn't find the door. This is the lesson of the unseen boundary. It is a line that doesn't appear on any map. You cross it the moment you decide that your plan is more important than the clouds on the horizon, or when you assume that a stranger is safe because he is standing in a public park. Evil and disaster don't always announce themselves with a roar. Sometimes they arrive as a singing wire on a climbing rope or a subtle change in the smell of the air in a mountain pass. The scariest thing you can encounter isn't a monster in the woods. It is the realization that your own logic has failed you. It is the sight of your own footprints, moving in a circle in the fog, or the sound of your gear humming with static electricity before the lightning strike. These are the moments where the ordinary world pulls back its curtain to show you the void. It is the feeling of being an intruder in a space that no longer recognizes your right to exist. We tell these stories not to keep you awake, but to remind you that the world is a much larger and more indifferent place than our routines suggest. Paranoia is a heavy weight to carry, but a little bit of healthy fear is what keeps you on the paved road. It is the voice that tells you to turn back when the tide starts to surge, or to double-check the labels on your gear before you climb into the clouds. Respect the boundary because the boundary is always there. Most of us will live our entire lives without ever seeing the red wall or the devil's throat. We will stay within the comfort of the central plateau where the coffee is hot and the locks on the doors hold firm. But the people we talked about tonight thought they were in that same world right up until the second they weren't. They were just like us, right until the moment the ground snapped or the mist turned blue. That is the part that stays with you. As you get ready to turn off the lights, take a second to appreciate the solid feel of the floor and the warmth of the room. These are the things we take for granted, the normal details that act as the foundation of our happiness. But remember that the foundation is a choice. Every night is a gamble, that the rules will stay the same until the morning. Usually they do. But for 14 families, the rules changed in the middle of a Tuesday, and the world never went back. I appreciate you spending this time with me in the dark. If these accounts gave you something to think about, or if they just helped you find a little bit of perspective while the rain falls, then the night was a success. If you haven't yet, consider subscribing or leaving a comment about the story that hit you the hardest. I read them all, and it helps me know which shadows we should explore next time. Your support is the only reason these stories get told. For now, it's time to let the fire go out. Check the locks one more time, not because you're afraid, but because it's a good habit to have. Make sure the windows are tight against the damp air and that the path to the door is clear. The world is a strange place, and it's always better to be the one who's watching than the one who's being watched. Stay safe out there and try to get some sleep. The sun will be up soon enough, and the ordinary world will return. Until then, keep your ears open for the sound of the wind through the trees and the rhythmic clapping of the water. Sometimes the silence is just a pause before the next story begins. We'll be here when you're ready to hear it. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad we can share these moments by the fire. It's a long walk back to the paved road, so take your time and watch your step. Good night, everyone. We will talk again very soon right here in the dark. Stay grounded. The ground is the only thing we have. Don't look for the abnormal, watch the ordinary. That is where the real stories are hiding, tucked into blue bags and white vans, waiting for someone to notice the crack in the ice. The unseen boundary is closer than you think. Sleep well if you can. The rain is still falling and the night is almost over. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and each other. The world is vast, but we are here.